Hello everyone, welcome back into another episode of Last Protagonist, streaming his reactions to a bunch of videos. I hope you're doing well. On yesterday's stream, we had a bit of an interview with Elden Dork to discuss some of the finer topics of his video, which did not get across from that directly, and we had a grand old time. So today we'll be continuing with the actual lore videos and stuff like that. So first on the list for tonight, I have Virtual Sisters Dark Souls 2 Understands the Pain of Fighting. Then we have a good one, hopefully, with Comrade Analysis's On the Stairs of Flesh, How Bloodborne Transcends Body Horror. Then a Human Justicar's Death in the Realm of Shadow, Elden Ring Lore and Theory. So a little bit of a variety of subjects, but that's part of the fun. So anyway, Skyleasy, Asnex, Mike Bailey, Levelvit, Elden Enthusiast, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back in. So, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive on into Virtual Sisters Dark Souls 2 Understands the Pain of Fighting. This video contains heavy spoilers for all three Dark Souls games. Not all footage used is theirs. Original uploaders will be fully credited. I probably need to turn up the volume for you guys. It's silent now.
There's this moment in Dark Souls 3 that I love. This final game in the trilogy is chock full of callbacks and references to the previous two, with even a few to the precursor game, Demon Souls. The most in-your-face callback to the first game is the return of Anor Londo, probably the most iconic and beloved location in the entire series. Anor Londo marked a significant shift in aesthetic for the first Dark Souls. Up until this point, you had been confined to crumbled towns and dank sewers. The reveal of Anor Londo as this beautiful, majestic cityscape that you get to explore is one that stuck with players for obvious reasons. Sure, you don't explore the entire city, you traverse a very small portion of what the skyline represents, but still, the only visible blemishes you find throughout this entire area are a couple of broken windows. Other than that, the only other hint that something is deeply wrong with this city is the lack of people. From what I remember, the only new NPCs you find in this entire area are a firekeeper and a giant blacksmith within the palace. It's not until after you clear the area, beat Ornstein and Smough, one of the few bosses in the base game I'd say I actually like, and attack the Sun Princess Guinevere.
Is that literally game footage? Thou that tarnisheth?
In the palace. It's not until after you clear the area.
Thou that tarnisheth the godmother's image. That's wild. Okay.
Beat Ornstein and Smough, one of the few bosses in the base game I'd say I actually like, and attack the Sun Princess Guinevere, that Anor Londo's enduring majesty is exposed as a sham, an illusion cast by Dark Sun Gwendolyn. Anor Londo returns in Dark Souls 3, a shell of its former self. It has been overrun by deacons, and in place of Ornstein and Smough with their gold ornate armour, is a god-eating slug puppeting the body of the prince that once upheld the beauty of the city through illusion.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, there's some localization oddities with Dark Souls 1 where I think all of the Silver Knight set was supposed to mention how Guinevere was an illusion, but it was only like the shield that had it in the English version of the game for some reason. So if you miss that item, you might never really get that environmental hint that not everything is as it seems.
I've seen people label the return of this area as cheap fan service, along with a lot of the other visual and story callbacks, but I personally think Dark Souls 3 handles it pretty well, actually continuing the story of the area and how you left it after the first game. You can even find the dead body of the giant blacksmith where you last saw him, a moment that
To be fair, I definitely understand why people say that it does feel like cheap fan service. It's cheap fan service. And I would even go so far as to say that I'm one of them, even though I do enjoy a lot of Dark Souls 3. I think part of the issue with the way that Gwendolyn is reused is that it seems to fly in the face of the lore presented to us in Dark Souls 2 about the ever-cycling kingdoms throughout the land, the rise and fall of them, and gods who are so ancient that everyone's forgotten their names. And so if all of these gods have become so aged and forgotten, then how the hell does Gwendolyn survive in some form for him to be fed to Aldrich in Dark Souls 3? So I definitely understand why fans feel that way. And it also, like, Anne Orlando's position in Irithyll does feel pretty tacked onto the area. Like, it doesn't feel like a progression of Anne Orlando from Dark Souls 1, and Dark Souls 3 doesn't do the best in presenting how the world / timeline is convoluted and how the lands are converging and everything. So there definitely could have been some improvements made in that respect, I feel. So welcome back in, Potato Poker and Pastor Muppets and Global. How's it going, guys? Potato says it feels like fan service. Yeah. Pastor said DS3 has the opposite problem of DS2. It plays too safe. I agree with you to an extent, and that's probably one of my bigger criticisms that I levied against it in my review of Dark Souls 3. But I think they were trying to refine too many systems, which they did very well, but they could have been a little bit bolder, or they needed to go all the way in one direction or the other. You're either like a full fan servicey type game and you just rely on it, or you're not. And this just kind of was a little bit of a lukewarm interpretation of both previous games a bit. Scaleezy's biggest gripe was the poise hyper armor system. Yeah, DS1 still has my favorite poise of all the games that I've played with the FromSoft catalog. Elden complains there's nothing to do there except run to Aldrich. Well, you get to look at your you get to meet your blacksmith friend, right? Right, guys?
genuinely made me feel something, which is more than a lot of games can say. The only remnants of Gwyn's reign are the Silver Knights, his eternal soldiers still guarding the palace from intruders. For me, Anne Orlando's return in this game is a highlight, but the moment that I love in this game doesn't happen in Anne Orlando. It happens not long before, in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. After trudging through some sewers and maybe even interacting with a completely different Dark Souls 1 callback, you enter this room, and in this room you find a Silver Knight staring blankly at a painting of Princess Guinevere. This one moment says so much more about the overarching themes of the Dark Souls series than anything else in the entire game. No amount of callbacks, previous areas and ideas stitched together, long monologues about rekindling the fire or an age of darkness really gets across what makes Dark Souls' story as emotionally affecting as it is, quite as much as this one Silver Knight. But this is a video about Dark Souls 2, so we'll come back to this later. Oh, Dark Souls 2. Wow, you guys really hate this one, huh? It's a well-known meme in gaming circles that Dark Souls 2 is the definitive black sheep of the series for a multitude of reasons. Upon release, it was up against insane expectations and stories of its troubled development, as well as the fact it wasn't directed by chosen gaming god Miyazaki, added fuel to the fire of people that didn't like the fact that this game did so much stuff different from the first. Not that base Dark Souls 2 is perfect, but its experimentation on the Dark Souls formula has positioned the game as a worthwhile entry into the series in my eyes, series, and I find it a very enjoyable game as long as you go into it with the right headspace. Though I do have to stress that I'm talking about the original version of the game, as I believe another reason that Dark Souls 2 has kept hold of its reputations 10 years on from release is that the most accessible version of the game across more in-date consoles is one that tunes the difficulty of the game towards people that already had solid experience with the original release.
Yeah, so the text on screen says it's not bad, I just don't think it's the best way for newcomers to play the game. And that is the general consensus that I've seemed to have heard around Dark Souls 2, that vanilla is a little bit more new player friendly. And from the little bit that I have seen of it, I would tend to agree. And yeah, I don't know, like Dark Souls 2 does a lot of interesting things with the mechanics that it tries to implement, but for me, it's just all about the game feel, and it just doesn't feel very good. And that could be its own video subject, because it has been its own video subject. We've seen videos talking about the weird control schemes and things like that before, and the animations and whatnot. So hey, Methoda, welcome back in. We are checking out Dark Souls 2 Understands the Pain of Fighting by Virtual Sister. From SoftServe is pulling out a total rebalance mod for DS2? Yes. At first, I read that as From Software, and I was about to be like, yeah, okay. Hey, Mal, welcome back in.
It's an unfortunate state of affairs, and I hope that if Dark Souls 2 does get the remastered treatment, it's the original version brought over, maybe with Scholar as a pack-in bonus or an alternate mode. Again, I'm not acting like it's flawless, but Dark Souls 2 is a game I have a lot of love for, and it's still frustrating to this day seeing people that never really engaged in the mechanics and changes warn players off from this entry entirely. Not only do I think Dark Souls 2 is a strong game from a mechanical and design standpoint, but I also think it has the best story of the entire trilogy, which is a take I actually see quite a few people agree with nowadays. Dark Souls 1 had great lore.
I don't know. I would disagree. I don't think Dark Souls 2 story is very good. I think 1 is a lot better in that regard, just in terms of the world building and actually directing the player where to go. So I would differentiate the story from the lore and say like story in terms of like the main narrative's quest, and lore is like all the stuff that comes along in the item descriptions. And with that kind of distinction there, I would say that I really like Dark Souls 2's micro lore the most, in terms of how its characters interact with the world, with them kind of going mad and coming to terms with the loss of their sanity. I think is a very nice touch that definitely could have benefited the other games a bit more. Because you have like Crestfallen in DS1, but he's also kind of a jerk, so nobody really gives a damn. And Dark Souls 3 doesn't quite have that so much. And of course, well, DS1 also has Siegmeyer, which is really good, in Sieglinde. So I guess it just depends on what you're going for. But I don't know. Dark Souls 2 feels a lot more hopeless than DS1. And DS1 just kind of keeps a cultivated air of mystique that just keeps getting worse and worse as you go along. Kind of like Bloodborne, which is probably why I like DS1 the most of the three. Hey, Captain, you're willing to be tribute to sacrifice to deny any remake of Dark Souls 2? What are we going to wait for? Trying to make an Oblivion joke, but I'm not clever enough to think of it off the top of my head. Scholars of the first Oblivion? Maybe, something like that. Asinex disagrees. The ideas behind it are more profound. The inevitability of the passage of time essential to the series. DS2 nails it. Maybe. I mean, of course, DS3 just goes in a bit of a different direction. So I think if you're looking at DS1 and DS2 in a vacuum, I definitely agree with that. I feel like DS3 does kind of definitively end things with at least 2 or arguably 3 of its endings, other than the Link one. So what I mean about the story is I think it's kind of garbage how you're supposed to just go into the Giants' memories without like any real indicator of like what's going on with all that. And some of the Vendrick stuff is a little bit of a mess with how it's presented, which isn't to say that I dislike it. It's just that DS2 definitely feels like one of those games where it feels like you need a guide to understand what the story is supposed to be, which I kind of hold it against, I guess, in my mind. Captini says the Aldia monologues are good, but that's all that's good. Aldia is pretty great. Okay, anyway, let's go back in.
but the actual plot of the game felt more like a brief closing chapter in a huge history book. Dark Souls 3 gave multiple endings that left the story of the series open, but its plot pulls heavily from past Souls games. It requires knowing the lore and the story of the first game to even understand what's going on and what the different endings mean for the world. Both games are also very unpersonal games. You feel very railroaded throughout the plot. In Dark Souls 1, you do what you do because you are the chosen undead and must follow some prophecy to link the flame and so on. At the end, you're given the choice between linking the flame or leaving the kiln, plunging the world into darkness, which could have been a cool ending, but the existence of more Dark Souls games makes it kind of fall flat. So I guess that's one point off of the existence of Dark Souls 2. In the third game, you are the Ashen One, an undead who once attempted to link the flame but failed, now brought back to life, who knows how many aeons later, to hunt down the Lords of Cinder, beings that once linked the flame and were resurrected to do it again, but refused, and then you once again link the flame. Or you don't. As I mentioned, Dark Souls 3 has multiple endings, and there was no fourth game to undermine the choice between them by ignoring it, and it's honestly really cool. You can choose an ending for the world, whether linking the flame or extinguishing it, pushing the world into the unknowable age of darkness, or you can choose for personal reasons, stealing the power of the flame and becoming King of the Hollows, plunging the world into the unknown for the benefit of anything that hollows, potentially restoring their humanity, though I really don't know. These choices are awesome, and they add a sense of actual choice in determining the future of the world of Dark Souls, a future I honestly hope we never see. But it takes until the end of the game for the player to have any real agency in events.
So the text on screen a moment ago, oh no, it is lost to time.
Determining the future of the world of Dark Souls, a future I honestly...
Technically, we do see the future at the end of the Ringed City DLC, however, if I remember correctly, this is so far in the future that our actions do not directly influence it.
Hope we never see. But it takes until the end of the game for the player to have any real agency in events. In Dark Souls 2, the player...
So Pastor Muppet asks, if you choose the Age of the Dark in DS1, what's stopping someone else from linking the flame? I guess that depends on what is required to link the flame. So one of my headcanons is that if you choose to save Solaire and then refuse to link, then he'll link it for you regardless. But of course you don't have to save Solaire. So I think that is essentially some people's canon of what happens in like their cosmology of Dark Souls if they chose to not link in their first game. But I feel like for most people, when they choose not to link, it tends to be an accident unless they already know about Koth and whatnot, and then do so deliberately.
The player never has any real agency in the events, including the ending, but that's the whole point. You are the bearer of the curse, a regular human that has become undead, doomed to die and come back over and over again, losing pieces of your sanity, your humanity, every time, hollowing with every cycle. The chosen undead in the first game was also undead, obviously, I mean it's in the name, but they are also the chosen one, destined to link the flame and burn out. The characters between the two games are similar, but
I don't know if the chosen undead is actually chosen or if it's a name of convenience given to somebody who would have inevitably come up to do it regardless. So it really just depends if you believe that it's a predestined outcome to an extent, or if Frampt and Koth are just kind of trying to take advantage of a situation. So I think there's room for both arguments, which can lead to some fun considerations further on down the line.
Have very different destinies. In Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse has made the journey to the far-off kingdom of Drangleic, heavily implied to stand where Lordran from the first game stood millennia before, to find some way of breaking the undead curse, some cure to this disease. The game's opening cinematic is rich with visual metaphor as we see a blank figure watch a woman and child melt away, representing the loss of memory from the point of view of the undead. This scene match cuts to a hand at a door, reminiscent of, and please for the love of God hear me out, The Killing Joke, a Batman story in which the Joker's tragic past is juxtaposed with his present day insanity, showing how losing everything drove a man to madness. A woman at a spinning wheel, a reference to oracles, tells us that even by the time we reach Drangleic, we will have forgotten why, and that we are destined, like all undead, to lose everything. Our past, our future, our souls, our humanity, because that is the fate of all that bear the curse. It's a recurring event in the world of Dark Souls. Hell, even the structure of the games themselves represent this. All three follow some kind of undead being journeying through a ruined kingdom, fighting smaller bosses to fight 4 main bosses that then allow you to fight a final, biggest boss in some kind of plot that involves both a royal family and linking the flame. It's a genuine sickness in the heart of all living things. The journey to Drangleic, to find a way to break the curse, is a worldwide madness. It's Vass's monologue on insanity on a mass scale, and yet Dark Souls 2 makes it so personal by sending you on this journey alone. Even during character creation, you're mocked by a group of former firekeepers, 3 women that have watched possibly thousands of undead pass through Drangleic for the futility of your quest. You're told at the beginning of the game exactly what is going to happen to you, but you try to break free anyway because that's all that there is left for you. At the end of the opening cinematic, the bearer of the curse falls into a giant black whirlpool, signifying the beginning of their journey into darkness. I promise I'm not trying to rip off H-Bomber Guy's segment about the opening from his Dark Souls 2 video, but he made a lot of fantastic points during it, even if the video as a whole is spotty and I don't think takes Matthew Matosis' criticisms of Dark Souls 2 seriously enough. And that's what
I like how that kind of whole drama thread is just kind of ubiquitous in the background lore of Dark Souls 2 in general, where it's just kind of referenced so frequently. Methodo's in the camp of mathematically inevitable undead. I'm not sure how I feel, to be honest. I think it'd be a little bit lame if we were like actually the chosen undead. So I'm guessing that I'm probably more inclined to believe mathematically inevitable, but I don't know. In Scally's opinion, you officially become the chosen undead when Guinevere gives you the Lord Vessel. Gwindovere, maybe.
Dark Souls 2 as a whole is a journey into darkness. In a lot of ways, the story of the bearer of the curse is the story of the world of Dark Souls confined to a single individual, an undead performing the same events over and over again in the hopes of holding on to a light that is destined to go out. The continuous linking of the first flame keeps the world from moving on. It makes the world sick, to the point where the hundreds of kingdoms that are buried beneath other kingdoms begin to resurface and corrupt the world by the time Dark Souls 3 rolls around, which makes the choice between linking the flame or letting the world enter the Age of Darkness such a compelling one in that game. The world of Dark Souls is so scared of letting go that it would rather see its people become increasingly diseased rather than march onward into a new era. The Age of Darkness may sound bad, but there's really no way of knowing whether or not it would be better or worse than the current Age of Fire. It's a leap of faith. I criticised Dark Souls 1 for being too railroady, but
I was going to say, a lot of this doesn't really pertain directly to Dark Souls 2, so I was wondering if he's going to bring it back for all that. Yeah, I definitely agree that the opening cutscene for Dark Souls 2 is really good, except for the damn Firekeepers. I wish they never existed.
Going to be a huge hypocrite and praise Dark Souls 2 for the same approach. I think the incredibly linear nature of the game and its narrative works because the plot and themes revolve around not being able to make any real changes to the world or player character. As I already mentioned, Dark Souls 2 tells the player how the story will end even before the game starts. In its original release, the game only had one ending, in which the bearer of the curse takes the throne of one and fades into the world, accepting their fate. Whether they link the flame or let it fade is never seen. The game fades to black on an undead monarch, destined to hollow in the same manner as King Vendrick and Gwyn before them. Another ending was eventually added with the DLC, but I don't think it changes much. Much like the first game's alternate ending, the player can reject the throne, leaving it to continue seeking a way to break the curse. Again, we never see if the bearer of the curse succeeds in their quest, but it's more than likely that they don't. After all, we're told as much at the start of the game. We never directly see the fate of the player character in either ending because we don't need to. We know that no matter what choice we make, we are destined to hollow out and lose our humanity. The first game featured a sprawling, interconnected world to explore.
I think on one hand he's sort of right, but I also disagree to an extent because I believe Aldi is trying to give you an essentially quote unquote middle way path that's kind of analogous to the middle way of Buddhism in a sense. So if you transcend the dichotomy of light and dark, of right and wrong, of life and death, then you kind of escape the cycle, literally, of samsara, like death and rebirth. And that will allow you to kind of reach nirvana potentially. Although I don't think it's quite the same in Dark Souls 2 or even Dark Souls 3 because the ancient dragon seems to be more Buddhist aligned to an extent, but Aldia did study dragons quite a bit, so maybe there is some more overlap there than I'm thinking of. So what else is I going to say about that? I guess I lost my train of thought. Shucks. So Methoda asked, do I have beef with the old firekeepers? I most certainly do. I hate the whole lines of like, hey, you're here, you don't know why, you're just gonna die over and over. Ha ha ha, lol. Like, bro, like, why? It just really takes me out of the fantasy setting, to be honest. And then Platinum Chip, welcome back into the stream. How you doing tonight?
That made sense to traverse and fight through. Dark Souls 2 has the opposite. The areas of the game don't fit together with any cohesion, and that is fantastic for this story. Much of fuss has been made about the fact that Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep don't make sense together, with the
Okay, I remembered. I'll back this up. So the other point that I wanted to make, which I seemingly just forgot, god dang, amassing souls, walking away. Oh yeah, the DLCs. So I would be more inclined to agree with Virtual Sisters here if the DLC wasn't about getting the stupid crowns allegedly preventing hollowing, which I really disliked the idea of anyway. And I would agree that the base game is pretty damn clear that no matter what somebody tries to do to overcome their hollowing, it's essentially going to end in ruin because they're like gripping essentially too strongly to life, and that's partially because they're cursed and things like that.
It made sense to traverse and fight through. Dark Souls 2 has the opposite. The areas of the game don't fit together with any cohesion, and that is fantastic for this story. Much of fuss has been made about the fact that Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep don't make sense together, with the former being this tall tower reaching into the sky. You reach the top and enter a lift, but it doesn't descend, it goes up. It keeps rising until you reach the molten grounds of the Iron Keep. This doesn't make any sense. Earthen Peak should be the peak of Drangleic, and yet seemingly above the place an entire area comes after. It doesn't make sense, and that's the perfect way to structure the world in a game about slowly losing yourself. My theory is that we aren't really seeing the bearer of the curse's entire journey, just the moments that were so impactful that they stuck with them until the end, until their mind faded. The world of Drangleic is confusing, disoriented, and contradictory because that's exactly what looking into the mind of a hollow would be like. The Dark Souls trilogy.
Hey Stella, nice to see you again. Scally's was saying people go crazy over the bear curing hollowing in Dark Souls 2 when it's kind of clear that it's just a game mechanic. Well, I mean, it is, but it kind of isn't also meant to be with how the DLCs highlight it, and the fact they have to go and get all that stuff from Vendrick and kind of craft it. It seems like Vendrick didn't make that work, and so it's supposed to like be the resolution of the Bearer of the Curse personal quest to stop going hollow. But I guess to make a terrible pun, it just kind of feels a little bit hollow to me with how it's executed.
Into the mind of a hollow would be like. The Dark Souls trilogy has always had tragic characters. In the first game it could be bosses like Gwen, or NPCs like Solaire or the Pale Lady. In Dark Souls 3 there's Yorm the Giant and the Twin Princes. In Dark Souls 2 though, we get probably the most well-written character in the series, in my opinion obviously. Early in the game you come across Lucatiel of Mira, a knightess from a faraway land who, like the player, has journeyed into Drangleic to find a way to break the undead curse. Across the game you continuously encounter Lucatiel as she slowly loses her grip on reality. The last time you meet her, she begs you to remember her name as her mind fades.
Consider this thanks for keeping me sane. My name is Lucatiel. I beg of you, remember my name.
The funny thing is, I had interrupted Lucatiel in her animation when she was taking off her mask in, what's the place called? Not the bell tower place, but the place where you go find the lost sinner, the lost Bastille. I interrupted her animation there, so she just permanently had the mask on for the rest of my playthrough, which is where I have like all my lore footage of her, and so she's masked, which is kind of funny. Potatoes just like Lucatiel for real, for real? Okay. That's the Elden Ring character. It is. I don't remember. Are her pants actually like red here?
For I may not myself.
In heartbreaking irony, Lucatiel's brother Aslatiel appears as an invader in a nearby area, having also travelled to Drangleic to break his curse, but has hollowed out. You never see Lucatiel again, her fate left unseen, but hardly unknown. I think what makes Lucatiel's story so much more heartbreaking is that in Dark Souls 2 you can actually negate the effects of hollowing, either by using human effigies or being gifted King Vendrick's blessing upon slaying the Hollowed King and beating the final bosses of all 3 DLC. I think what makes these methods interesting is that, despite reversing or even completely stopping the events of hollowing, they are temporary solutions to a permanent problem. Neither break the undead curse. Human effigies are single-use items. Even if they restore your humanity, the next time you die you begin to hollow again, and this resource is finite. Still, it's heartbreaking to see Lucatiel hand the player an effigy not knowing its purpose. She could.
I kind of wonder if diegetically the reason why blacksmiths tend to be so long-lived is because war never changes. And so they always need to keep smithing weapons. So essentially their purpose is more or less never ending until somebody links, I guess. So Helanthropist, nice to see you again. Scally's, said there's an implication that Lucatiel's kind of dumb and went hollow because she ignored the human effigies. Could you elaborate on that? I don't think I've heard that theory specifically. And then Chadwick, nice to see you again. Chadwick said, the hero of the box art armor in DS2 is really a triumph of style, just fantastic looking. The funny thing is, I did almost pause it a moment ago to be like, oh man, the From set does look pretty dope. And then I didn't because it's like, that's kind of irrelevant. And I paused frequently enough anyway that it was going to kill the flow of the video. Oh yeah, that's right, Astynex, thank you. When you first meet Lucatiel, she gives you the human effigy saying she doesn't know what it's for. Thank you, I totally forgot.
Could have held on, even for a little longer, had she known. The blessing of the king only works for as long as you wear one of the 4 crowns. You're still cursed, and though you're no longer hollowing out with each cycle of death, what use is living eternally in a world that's crumbling under the weight of its own history? And that brings us back to Dark Souls 3, the Silver Knight, and the painting of Guinevere. I intentionally didn't explain why exactly this single moment was so compelling. I didn't tell you why I thought it was a perfect encapsulation of the story of Dark Souls, or why it was so emotionally impactful to me. I didn't explain myself because Dark Souls 2 explains it so succinctly. Gwyn's Silver Knights were tasked with guarding Anor Londo, and the remaining soldiers have been continuing to guard it ever since the first game, through hundreds of kingdoms built on top of its remains for God knows how many aeons. These knights have hollowed out. They spent so long doing the same thing over and over again that they've lost themselves, as all undead do. And this one knight, in this one room, stares at this portrait of the Princess of Sunlight, somebody that these soldiers spent so long protecting the illusion of. And there's a spark of recognition there. Somewhere, deep inside the faded mind of this being, something sees Guinevere and latches onto a memory that barely exists anymore.
Just so he could serve as bait for you to get shot in the back.
Dark Souls 3 uses environmental storytelling and a mesh of new and old areas to tell its story incredibly well, showing how a refusal to let go and letting the world naturally change has led to everything folding into itself, the world imploding under itself. And yet none of that storytelling really conveys the tragedy of Dark Souls quite as well as this single Silver Knight.
Thanks for watching. Alright, so you Goombas who are saying that you wouldn't go hollow because, Hold on here. Because you would goon too hard? I got some bad news for you guys. You think the hollows who miss pooping so much or have the capacity to continue to goon? I don't think so. Methoda said you thought Patches never went hollow? Maybe. I mean, there's arguments whether or not he is the same dude throughout all the games, whether he gets time warped or whatever headcanon that works. Yeah, so if you think you can't poop, that you'd still be able to goon, I #doubt it. Stella said, wow, what did I miss? So you missed Captini and Soholanthropus gooning out in the chat like weirdos. All right, anyway, thanks for watching. That was a nice and enjoyable video. I was hoping he was going to talk about how much it hurts to get punched in the face, but this is acceptable as well. So that was the video from Virtual Sister. I believe they said in the description that was their first video. Oh, no, maybe not. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Okay, I want to see what all else they have on their channel. The art of being bad at video games. That's not for me. All right. I'm not too interested in that stuff, at least for the lower channel purposes. But I'm going to go ahead and like the video because that was enjoyable. And then next, we'll do something a little bit different with a Bloodborne video. On the Stairs of Flesh, How Bloodborne Transcends Body Horror by Comrade Analysis. Content warning. This video will contain explicit body horror imagery. It will also contain mentions of sexual assault and extreme violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Also, huge spoilers for Bloodborne. If you've not already, go and play it. Best game I've ever played. Changed my life. Thank you for watching. All right, cool. Here we go.
Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem. Somebody, help me. Unshackle me, please. Anybody. I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
It's official. It's been 10 years since we first stepped into the bloody
Why are the subtitles so off?
streets of Yharnam. 10 years of slaughter, glorious Victorian aesthetics, and of course, cosmic terror. As the Bloodborne community awaits the news on the never-arriving sequel, one has to wonder whether the Sony's lack of care for the IP was actually a part of Miyazaki's nightmarish vision for the game, making Bloodborne to a kind of purgatory where we enter again and again in hopes of the never-coming sequel. But jokes aside, even a decade later,
Haha, this dude didn't make his video recently enough because we heard about Duskbloods, the true Bloodborne 2. No, I don't know. So this video did come out 2 weeks ago. So Duskbloods was announced 2 weeks ago, right? I'm just memeing, aren't I?
there is still so much about Bloodborne that remains unsaid. For example, while Bloodborne's horror has been extensively covered by other essay channels, a crucial component underpinning most of Bloodborne's horror still remains heavily underanalyzed. That being, the bodies of Bloodborne. Through an
Yeah, he probably makes up a pretty good point here. I think maybe the only channel that I'm super aware of doing stuff like this in any amount of detail would be Charred Thermoses. So, hey David Will, welcome into the stream. What's my take on the procession of stars mentioned in the DLC? For Elden Ring, I'm kind of assuming that it's supposed to be a reference to the primeval current, essentially, or like shooting stars in general. And that might tie into how like Lusat and Azur kind of lose their minds once they realize that the universe is so big that life and death doesn't matter. And if everything exploded so long ago, it's just all a foregone conclusion, perhaps. But I digress. Welcome into the stream. Astanex said Duskblood being on the Switch 2 is the only reason to buy the Switch 2? Bro, how can you say that? Like, even though I'm not the biggest Nintendo fanboy around, you have to admit that the Nintendo flagship titles are pretty goated for what they are. And I unironically bought the Wii U specifically just for Smash Bros. And don't regret that purchase.
An overview of Bloodborne's body horror, analysis of the relationship between the player, Bloodborne's bodies, and the environment, and ultimately the examination of the game's true ending, I will argue that Bloodborne's world, gameplay, and the overarching story create an experience that at its core facilitates a post-human view of flesh within its players.
Gameplay by Crystal 109. Music by Sound Phenomenon and Sony Entertainment. Hope narration by Raymond Magdalene. Script, narration, and editing by Comrade Analysis. On the Stairs of Flesh. How Bloodborne transcends body horror.
So, as per tradition, we need a summary of Bloodborne. As many of you may know, Bloodborne, like most of From Software titles, is a game where most of the story is conveyed through its environments and...
Alright guys, subtitles are going off for this video because they're so delayed, or if anybody in the chat really wants them, let me know and then I will enable them.
Item descriptions, creating for an experience open to countless interpretations. So, here's the most cohesive explanation I could come up with. So Bloodborne is primarily a single-player, open-world, survival, gothic, horror narrative taking place within the monster-overrun Victorian city of Yharnam. This all takes place during the event referred to as the Night of the Hunt. At the start of the game, the player's character, a monster hunter, imbibes a healing blood that is used as a kind of panacea by the citizens of Yharnam. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the hunter becomes connected to a separate plane of existence called the Hunter's Dream. This dimension/connection grants them the ability to infinitely return after death until they fulfill their assigned quest. This quest is to seek pale blood to transcend the hunt. From there, the player experiences all manners of atrocities, slaughtering the lycanthropic beasts around every street corner, dying again and again and uncovering the history of the city. Progressively, the game gets, let's say, weirder. The horror very quickly shifts from the gothic to cosmic, as the true nature of the events within the city is slowly revealed to the hunter as the work of a Lovecraftian set of gods, the Great One.
I really enjoy the Duck 360 gaming over here in the corner. Anyway, Scott Leasy said, as someone that's been hunting, you have many criticisms of the hunters in Bloodborne. Oh, because you want them to hang out in the trees a little bit more often? That's understandable, bro.
Gradually, the player discovers that the Beast Plague was a product of human hubris, as the Healing Church had attempted to bring mankind to the next step of its evolution, an attempt to be like the Great Ones. Yet it failed, damning the city of Yharnam to become more beast-like than godlike. If you're interested in a proper explanation of Bloodborne's lore, I highly recommend Brothers Code's video, Bloodborne Story Explained. Really great content there. Please check it out. To avoid confusion for the remainder of this essay, we should define the term post-humanism. According to an article by Daniele Rugo, the term is used differently throughout scholarly discourses, but the definition we are going to be using is going to be a mode of being resulting from potential enhancements to human nature. So the word post-human essentially means after-human, and typically one might imagine a cyborg when thinking of post-humanism, but one could also argue that such an outlook is only transhuman, as the body augmentations are there to supplement the human at their center. Meanwhile, post-humanism instead aims to completely decenter the human experience from a body and move beyond it.
I definitely appreciate the distinction that they're making here.
In their book, How We Became Posthuman, Catherine Hales provides 4 assumptions built into the posthuman worldview. 1. Posthumanism poses that embodiment in a biological substrate, like a body, is seen as an accident of history rather than an inevitability of life. 2. That consciousness is a kind of accidental accessory of existence rather than its sole purpose. 3. That the body is the original prosthesis we all learn to manipulate, so that extending or replacing the body with other prostheses becomes an a continuation of a process that began before we were born. And
Hold on, let me read that meme. When I'm in a crappy list formatting competition, and my opponent is Comrade Analysis.
a continuation of a process that began before we were born. And 4, that there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanisms and biological organisms, robot technology and human goals.
That's teleology.
Now, don't mind the computer element. What matters most here is that the human body is essentially an open ground for reconfiguration. So if one is familiar with Bloodborne's themes of becoming like the
Yeah, so going back to some of that list, those are some bold claims that I almost felt like commenting on, but then I realized it'd probably just be better to move past them, especially it was really this line right here, that the body, that you're extending or replacing the body with other prostheses becomes a continuation of a process that began before we were born. So I'm assuming before we were born here might be meant in like a more literal, not metaphysical sense. So like the part of you that began to exist after conception, but actually before birth. So essentially when you're still in the womb. That would be pretty much the only way this would make sense to me in the context of what I'm going to assume is a like more empirical type of claim. So I could be wrong about that, but I get it. Like, how, I guess I don't really often joke about it enough to say that I joke often about it, but for the sake of the story, I often joke that in Dark Souls games, you're essentially a piloting a meat bag with your humanity, and it's a mecha game. So the same thing might be able to apply to this worldview as well, that your meat mecha is just like the first phase of what you can go on to become if you keep augmenting your consciousness. And so once you transcend the human body, then it just becomes a continued process, I'm guessing, based off of these arguments here.
and human goals. Now, don't mind the computer element. What matters most here is that the human body is essentially an open ground for reconfiguration. So if one is familiar with Bloodborne's themes of becoming like the Great Ones, one can begin to see that the pursuit of a post-human state is at the very core of Bloodborne's narrative, as the overarching quest of Bloodborne is to move beyond humanity as we understand it.
And some think that becoming a great one could be the end of that state as far as like Bloodborne is concerned. But I would also like to draw some attention to the Yharnam Stone, which is a, calcified fetus essentially that has its consciousness persist despite its body being destroyed. And that could also tie into this post-human perspective here. So it's not necessarily transforming into a baby slug. It could just be having a mind that's so great that it isn't completely limited by the body from which it originated. Stella said, Souls games are Armored Core, but ghosts piloting corpses? Or piles of wood, depending on how you feel about hollows, but yes. That's why there's the joke about how wait, what? How does the joke go? Oh, it's the wood pill. So if you take the wood pill in terms of Dark Souls, you believe that all of the hollows are essentially just like wood bodies coming from like the everlasting arc trees, essentially, and the dragons. I mean, it's really just like the trees. So if you take the wood pill, then you just have like the humanity sprites getting lodged into tree hollows, essentially, and becoming man-like, and it's all an illusion. All right, thank you, David. I appreciate you dropping by. Take care.
However,
Or ghost piloting living bodies. Ghost piloting corpses is something else. Speaking of ghosts and bodies and machines, y'all hear that they're remaking the Ghost in the Machine, or Ghost in the Shell? I said Ghost in the Machine. Anyway.
given the horrific events that unfold within Yharnam, one can dismiss Bloodborne as a text that highlights the futility of such an attempt, the hubris of mankind. Yet when examining the overarching experience of playing Bloodborne, a very deterministic, causally inevitable outlook on the post-human future is revealed.
And I'm just going to try to refresh. So 640. I want the subs
Given
to
the
work.
horrific events that unfold within Yharnam, one can dismiss Bloodborne as a text that
No, they just don't work. Okay.
highlights the futility of such an attempt, the hubris of mankind. Yet when examining the overarching experience of playing Bloodborne, a very deterministic, causally inevitable outlook on the post-human future is revealed.
Part 1. The Unstable Flesh of Bloodborne. Bro, this font is messing with my eyes. I'm like, unstable?
While Bloodborne is undoubtedly a gothic horror experience and arguably the platonic ideal of cosmic horror video games, both of these effects are created on a very thick foundation of a different kind of horror. That is, of course, the horror of the body. Again, to avoid the confusion, let us also define the term body horror. Body horror is rather loose. It primarily refers to a trend in media concerned with disturbing imagery of the body. This imagery implies anything from straightforward mutilation of bodies like we often see in slasher horror films. For example, Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th macheting his victim's face. And this ranges all the way to extreme bodily mutilations like we see in David Cronenberg's 1986's The Fly or John Carpenter's 1982's The Thing. At its core, body horror is about the changing of our bodies. It is comforting to think of ourselves as stable entities, but body horror reminds us of the contrary, that flesh is in fact by its nature unstable, something that will one day decay, and that at any moment, any number of terrible contortions could redefine the borders of our bodies. As identified by David Huckvale in their book Terrors of the Flesh, The Philosophy of Body Horror in Film, the way Friedrich Nietzsche frames the body in relation to the soul can be a helpful lens for thinking about the existential terror behind body horror. I am body entirely and nothing beside, and soul is only a word for something in the body. In this paradigm, if there is such a thing as a soul, the very core of who we are becomes determined by the changes that occur to our bodies. Think of the classic example of Phineas Gage getting his head pierced by railroads.
How is the volume for you guys? It feels like it's getting progressively quieter as I listen, so I can't really bump it up that much more at all, to be honest. But yeah, this is as high as I can make it now.
Spike, and how he suddenly became a different person as a result. Another lens for engaging with body horror that will be used extensively throughout this video essay was heavily explored by Yara Zane in their video The Catharsis of Body Horror. Definitely check it out. The lens I am referring to is body horror as a form of meditation, something that allows us to reflect on ourselves. By witnessing horrific contortions of the human form, one is prompted to be more present within their own body, whether imagining the sensations of the bodily transformations or just being reminded that they have a body. My good friend Leonardo has pointed out the similarity between this framework and the one proposed by the 9 stages of decay, a Buddhist meditation practice in which one imagines their own decaying body in all of its 9 stages of decay. So ultimately, body horror allows one to reconceptualize oneself not as a stable individual, but as an unstable individual flesh. And this bodily reconceptualization is precisely what Bloodborne thrives on to push forward its post-human message.
The body horror of Bloodborne. So how do you guys feel about that? For me, I guess in some ways, like, body mutilation is a little bit more scary than the concept of death itself. In maybe it's a little bit too tame for a reference, but I'm trying to struggle to think of a better one. Like, in some ways, if a hero is fighting like the grand villain at the end of their quest, it's a little bit easier to accept that they die and get sacrificed at the end of their quest, rather than they like triumph but end up misfigured as a result. So this is not the best example, but like Luke getting dismembered when he fights Darth Vader is pretty shocking, I guess, maybe the first time you see it if you're not used to that kind of thing. But there's probably better examples that I'm struggling to think of. But so to said, it feels like the volume jumps up and down a bit between the takes, but nothing too bad. Okay. Captini says, I have no mouth and I must scream is worse than death. What's the point of becoming a huge horrid monster? Why does there need to be a point? It's not very Buddhist of you, Chadwick. Got him.
Alright, so before proceeding in the discussion of body horror within Bloodborne itself, I should note that this section will offer a very brief overview of Huckvale's 8 categories of body horror identified within their aforementioned book. These categories include copulation, generation, digestion, mutilation, infection, mutation, disintegration, and finally, extinction. Each category arguably warrants its own essay, but for the purpose of the greater argument, we only need to establish that all these 8 categories are to some degree present within Bloodborne. We will linger on some of the more pervasive categories in Bloodborne, and glance over some to demonstrate the extent to which Bloodborne facilitates its players' meditation on the concept of the body. This list will take a few minutes, so if you already agree that Bloodborne's body horror fits into all of those aforementioned 8 categories, you can go ahead and skip the list by going to the following timestamp.
That's kind of wild. Yeah, there wasn't anything that stood out to me as not entirely working for that, but I'm interested in what he has to say, so let's continue.
Alright, let's do this.
Copulation.
Copulation, sex, the act of making a body, is a frequent theme in the works of body horror. However, this category is mainly on the backdrop of Bloodborne, as I suspect Bloodborne would be unbearably horrific had it been sexually explicit. However, in a sense it is still a very substantial theme within Bloodborne, as rape by gods and cosmic entities
Bro, it's America's rune.
is a driving point of several plot points in Bloodborne. Especially noteworthy is the storyline with Ariana, the woman of the night who finds herself unwillingly bearing the child of a great one. As pointed out by Cupcake Souls in their video essay Violent Equality, the Gender of Bloodborne, Alfred's assault of Queen Annalise is coded as a sexual assault. But enough said, moving on. Generation. Childbirth. A painful and dangerous experience necessitated by the creation of human life and bodies. In Bloodborne, childbirth is constantly presented as horrific, with the babies frequently being depicted as monstrous, like in the case of the aforementioned Ariana. Her weeping over her child is probably one of the most disturbing moments in Bloodborne many players often miss out on. If you're interested in seeing a proper exploration of this category of body horror, please check out Honeybat's Visceral Femininity Bloodborne video essay. The birth section is especially relevant to the topic. Great work.
Digestion.
What things we eat, how we cook them, how we eat
Burger.
them, how they digest, and how they don't, are all frequent subjects of body horror.
Methodes said, you think Ariana's baby is cute in a kind of pug way? That's funny. I mean, it isn't like the most grotesque thing I've seen, I can admit that much for sure.
Enemies eating things is a prevalent motif in Bloodborne, and it just so happens to always be flesh that they're eating, be it the murderous crows consuming a dead horse, a cannibal consuming some human remains, or, well, a giant shark monster literally swallowing the hunter whole, etc. All these instances serve as a reminder of how organic bodies are naturally positioned in relation to each other.
Or a pretty bad one I felt was Invincible's snack time scene, if you know what that is a reference to as well.
As forms of sustenance. And ultimately, even we, humans that so often consider ourselves outside of the natural order, can easily be reduced to the shit and piss of other organisms. Notably, the hunter is a figure that...
Actually, yeah, I think a lot of the things in Invincible tend to fall into that body horror category, which is almost worse than like getting off-screened, I think.
Equally partakes in predation, consuming the blood echoes of their foes, drinking blood, and by the end of the game, in the most literal sense, devouring umbilical cords. In all these instances, the hunter is someone who consumes the bodies of others for personal betterment, a theme that we'll come back to later in this video.
Mutilation.
Dismemberment is a worse horror than death itself, because the physical horror of dismemberment is the gateway of an even more profound existential horror, that of identity. If we are no more than the sum of our parts, where does our center lie? Do we indeed have a center?
One of the most prevalent examples of mutilation in Bloodborne would be the removal of eyes that we see everywhere, from bosses like Father Gascoigne to getting our own eyes gouged out by witches. One
Ice cream.
can also think of the patients in the research hall, or Ludwig after his boss fight, reduced only to their still living heads. Special examples of mutilation that on the surface are not obvious as mutilation are cramped caskets and the One Reborn, entities composed of tons of human bodies melded together. In their instance, the horror of mutilation applies in a reversed sense, where the player is left to ruminate not just on the terror of how they might lose something that makes them whole, but that their entire identity can be reduced to organs of something else, shifting the center of their identity to outside of their own body. Infection, pestilence, and vermin are everywhere in Bloodborne, with the beast scourge being the central driving force behind the narrative. The body in Bloodborne is very clearly portrayed as a space of intrusions, be it by plagues or parasites. Think of the entire area of Old Yharnam, where the Ashen Blood sickness essentially destroyed a city. Some notable examples of parasites, on the other hand, would include the vermin hosts in the Forbidden Woods, and the parasite of Cause, which the hunter willingly lets in as a contorting source of power. If you're interested in seeing a unique exploration of infections in Bloodborne, check out Anethico's video essay, The Parasites in Bloodborne Explained.
Well, I'm really surprised at how much depth that they have about just some of the more random YouTube videos on the subject. They've definitely done the research.
Guidance and the Thread of Light. Really great stuff.
Mutation.
Mutation is arguably the most prevalent form of body horror in Bloodborne, with a lycanthropic plague affecting the majority of Yharnam. From its poorest beggars to the most renowned clerics, all are changing and are made beastly. Ludwig is an especially great example of mutation in Bloodborne, a man fused with a horse, made into a shambling, screaming mess that somehow manages to be one of the most challenging boss fights in the whole game. We also see mutations explored through the kin, humans who had attempted to become akin to the Great Ones, in the process turning into these slimy blue aliens. The list goes on, applying to the vast majority of people encountered by the player throughout the game. Overall, mutation highlights the instability of what actually constitutes a human being within Bloodborne, which opens us up to thinking about the untapped possibilities hidden within flesh.
Disintegration.
So, admittedly a less emphasized element of Bloodborne's body horror, disintegration, incineration, or anything else that reduces a body to nothing is still present within the game. The most prevalent example of disintegration can be seen when the hunter dies. Their death animation shows a corpse collapsing and turning to dust.
Okay, I was wondering like how this was so significantly different from mutilation. So I guess like the fear of disintegration is kind of like the fear of annihilation in a bit of a more meta way, I suppose.
The werewolf that gets burned alive in the first cutscene of the game qualifies for this as well. And one could also look at the burning corpses throughout the majority of the game. So, yeah, moving on. Death
Extinction.
overflows Yharnam. Throughout Bloodborne, one meets far more dead than living. The streets of Yharnam brim with gravestones and chained coffins, and as the night progresses, fewer and fewer living remain. Close to the start of the game, Eileen the Crow, the hunter of hunters, tells the player,
"Prepare yourself for the worst. There are no humans left. They're all flesh-hungry beasts now."
right off the bat, implying that humanity, as we know it, is already dead. And as the player encounters more and more of the still living, by the end of the game they're practically all reduced to corpses, beasts, and ultimately go mad.
And to be fair, like all the people out on the streets
And as
are
the player encounters more and more of the still
pretty much half transformed already, because when you look at their left arms, they're all extremely long. That's not how a normal person's left arm looks, although I guess you could make the claim that some of the girls in Hemwick aren't quite this transformed, but they don't seem to have their minds all there at the end anyway. Methoda said, for a town with a miracle cure, there's sure a lot of gravestones about. True. Well, they never claimed that they could cure death, but they seem to do a good job against tetanus, considering how often I've been hit with rusty saws and not gotten the ailment. Stella said, think of all the people who would inhale you if you dusted it into the window. So, bro, I don't know. Like, I did not realize how much you breathe in other people's breath until vaping became more of a thing. Also, before vaping, I did have a coach for track who was a right bastard man who liked to smoke vanilla cigarillos while he was coaching the field dudes, essentially, for what they were doing. So that was a real pain in the ass, running around the track while inhaling somebody else's smoke when you're trying to suck as much breath into you as you can. Anyway. Hey, Without Horns, welcome back in. Oh, no. Oh, wait, no, you've been here for a while, huh? Maybe I missed you earlier. And in other words, I missed you earlier.
Still living. By the end of the game, they're practically all reduced to corpses, beasts, and ultimately go mad. The continuation of mankind feels unlikely at best, and as such, the anxiety of permanent end seeps through the entire experience.
Okay, like, this is getting so damn quiet. It's really hard for me to understand it. I already do have all of my volume maxed on my end. Did I? Yeah, even this is maxed. Okay.
Ultimately go mad. The continuation of mankind feels unlikely at best, and as such, the anxiety of permanent end seeps through the entire experience of Bloodborne. There, all 8 categories of body horror are encountered by the player during the night of the hunt. This cacophony of body violations comes together to create a meditative introspection of what it means to have a body. That is, of course, in Bloodborne's case, to suffer and die, or another secret third thing. While the gory imagery is done to disgust and terrify the player, that is only a surface analysis of Bloodborne's body horror. Eventually, the horror of Bloodborne numbs the player to itself, leaving them to face the wider implications of their new way of seeing the body.
Right, so I do have a potential workaround for you guys who are struggling to hear the video as well. It's that I can lower my microphone so that way my voice isn't much louder than the videos itself, and then you can increase your volume. So if you guys want me to do that, let me know. Otherwise, we'll just kind of have to suffer through this together. And then Zero, nice to see you again.
As opposed to body horror in film, the body horror in Bloodborne is experienced not as a passive image to be absorbed by the player, but rather to be inspected, understood, and ultimately mastered. So when considering the game's medium in conjunction with the violent treatment of bodies that it demands from its players, the body is revealed to be one of the greatest factors actively contributing towards the post-human rhetoric embedded within Bloodborne.
That part was kind of loud. I mean, it wasn't really that loud, but I'm sure that if I had turned up the volume even more, it would seem that... Okay. Hey, Throw, nice to see you again. It's not that bad? All right, thank you. Part 2 on beastly and cerebral bodies.
We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. Marshall McLuhan. While the content of Bloodborne is important to consider, its video game medium actively shapes the message of said content. One lens for thinking about Bloodborne as a game would be Ian Bogost's concept of procedural rhetoric, identifying how the laws of Bloodborne affect the creation of its overarching messages during the player's engagement with those laws. As Skolnick explains,
the player's experience is constructed and mediated by the interactions of rules forming a simulation that is at the core of a video game. Therefore, rules come before the player experience in determining the video game's meaning.
Bogus wrote that the primary reason for video game analysis is seeing how they reveal what it means to be human, and in the case of Bloodborne, to understand the presented human experience, one must examine the rules that govern the relationship between the player and the body of the hunter, bodies of Bloodborne citizens, and of course, Yharnam itself.
Witness you.
In their essay on the rhetoric within video game bodies, Sky Anderson points out that all gaming takes place in and through and around bodies, and there is no such thing as a game that ignores bodies entirely. And as such, we must consider the link between the player and their game body, the hunter. As a video game, Bloodborne extends the player's body into screen space, creating a sense of immersion in the presented content.
So just thinking about that in general, if you don't limit yourself to video gaming and just think of games in general, there's certainly mental games you could play, but then of course you could always revert back to the argument that the mentality is rooted in the body to begin with. But I guess word games are also contingent on like using your mouth or lungs and a conjunction of other bodily parts to produce sound for communication. Or if you did it all mentally, does that not count as gaming for this? Anyway, that might be a little bit too pedantic here. Bastard said Tetris. You gotta finagle the pieces to get them in their places. That there is actually a really big skill check for Tetris in terms of how quickly you can maneuver the pieces around. So dexterity is kind of the common denominator in whether or not you can proceed to the next levels of Tetris, because it continues to go faster and faster. Metoda says Sudoku. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good mental one, but you could make the argument that you have to physically place the numbers and the grids and stuff, so that's why I was thinking perhaps like word games might be good enough. Chadwick said thought experiments aren't really games. Well, I mean, if you are making a thought game for yourself that's a bit of an experiment, I think that could still meet the criterion of a game, but not necessarily have to involve like the physical body in the strictest sense of the idea. Hilko and Without Horns say the same thing. Committing Sudoku is pretty body focused or horror? Okay.
The way Bloodborne performs this extension into the screen space is unique when considering how it plays with its points of view. When the game begins, the player is witness to the first-person cutscene where they agree to undergo the blood ministration procedure, essentially imbibing eldritch blood to heal themselves. Then, as a result of the procedure, they are selected by a cosmic entity to do their will, and they become tied to the pocket dimension of the hunter's dream, as we mentioned earlier. Then, as the intro cutscene ends, the player's perspective completely shifts to third person. For the remainder of the game, the player's perspective remains in third person, with a minor exception when they are abducted by the Snatcher. By situating the player's perspective within the body of the hunter, the player is made to identify with the hunter as themselves within Yharnam, as their own body. Yet through the blood administration, the player is ripped out of the body and made to be an external observer of themselves. Through this shift, the player's engagement with Bloodborne begins to decenter the player from their own human body. This change in perspectives serves as the first instance of procedural rhetoric pushing the player towards the post-human mindset. Then, for the rest of the game, the third-person POV is a passive rhetorical strategy to get the player to examine the human body from a less anthropocentric perspective. The imbibing of blood literally makes one self-aware, self-reflect on their own body, presenting the body from a more objective third person. This shift to third person could also be interpreted as a kind of loss of identity, as after signing the contract, the hunter's memories do not come into play ever again. They are functionally no one, tabula rasa, a complete outsider to Yharnam and their own body. When the game begins, the player does not know what has transpired in Yharnam, and their character functions as a vessel for a creation of their own story in search of an identity. Marshall McLuhan, a cornerstone philosopher for media theory, says the following on the loss of identity.
Violence is the natural response of somebody who has lost his identity. When people lose their image of themselves and their identities, they become very angry, very disturbed, and very violent. For example, in the Western, in our famous genre of violence, in the typical Western, the people on the frontier are people without identity. When people went out west to the frontier, they automatically became nobodies. They began to fight to prove that they were somebody. The violent man is typically in quest of who am I? What am I?
So, through this lens, one can interpret the violence of the hunter as a pursuit of understanding who they are. By priming the
You know, that's kind of a very interesting quote and idea in general. And that makes me wonder how much of that is cultural. Because, I mean, in a sense, isn't like the Wild West essentially just a state of mind? And I don't know how fair the comparison is, because, I mean, to the Native Americans, they may have thought themselves at home and not necessarily on the quote-unquote frontier. And so I don't know if they would have had to have those feelings of proving that they were somebody rather than a nobody because they're out on the frontier. But nonetheless, I think that's a very interesting thought that I'd want to ruminate on a bit more.
player towards a journey of self-understanding, Bloodborne gives itself the power to define the hunter's body for the player. Ultimately, Bloodborne does not tell its player who they are, as at no point does the hunter come to terms with some element of their past memories, but rather what they are, with the game actively defining what it means to have a human body within its world. Pardon, this part might get a bit complex, so please bear with me. Another lens for looking at Bloodborne's medium is through the work of the aforementioned Marshall McLuhan.
Oh yeah, so the most ironic thing was when I was struggling to think of some body horror examples which can strike people as being worse than like being sacrificed at the end of their journey. That's literally what happens at the end of Bloodborne with the third ending. When you transcend to become a babby great one, you lose your human body and become a slug. And a lot of people dislike that ending because they lose their human body and see themselves as a slug. They're like, I don't want that. Well, would they have just preferred to potentially die to end the hunt? Unironically, maybe. So, Methoda said, you feel like we're thinking about this a lot, but Gehrman specifically told you to not think too hard about all this. Well, did you ever consider that if Gehrman thought a little bit more, he might not have ended up in a wheelchair? So maybe you shouldn't take what he says to heart.
He had proposed the concept of hot and cool media, which will prove useful for understanding the degrees of player participation in the world of Bloodborne. McLuhan defines hot media and cool media as follows.
Hot media extends one single sense in high definition. High definition is the state of being well filled with data. Hot media does not leave so much to be filled in or completed by the audience. Hot media are, therefore, low in participation, and cool media are high in participation or completion by the audience.
An example of hot media would be YouTube Shorts, a medium in which the audience passively takes in a flow of information, while cool media would be a telephone, which requires significant audience participation. As user participation grows, the medium cools, and as the participation decreases, the medium heats up. Hope that's clear.
All right, you heard it here, chat. If you are participating in the chat, that means that you're pretty cool. All right, Acid X, thanks for joining us, and you have a good night.
By Marshall McLuhan's terms, Bloodborne's core gameplay would undoubtedly be considered a mainly hot medium, as Bloodborne functions as a very high-definition experience featuring generally low participation from the player. Now, low participation does not mean that the player is not doing anything.
Bro, is this the alpha? Like, check out the blood vial and the UI. This is very different.
Because with Bloodborne, the player has to be extremely involved to keep their character from dying. Instead, low participation should be interpreted as a degree to which the participant has to actively think about the content of the medium to engage with said content. In their essay on hot cool media,
Playing it cool considering McLuhan's hot and cool taxonomy for game studies. He's probably about to say this.
Video games, Conway identifies the hot media video games as tending towards bursts of intense emotions, frissions in response to psychosomatic pressure instigated through the high-fidelity features such as explicit win-lose conditions, time-sensitive mechanics, and tight cycles of interaction, which all very much fit into the core gameplay features of Bloodborne. With hot media, the player must be reactive, while with cold media, the player must be proactive. Why does this matter? Well, the distinction of hot and cool helps us examine the degree of participation expected from the player throughout their journey in Yharnam. When Bloodborne heats up, the in-game participation becomes more beastly, more physical, and when the game cools down, the participation becomes arguably more cerebral. The predominant gameplay loop lures the player into reveling in slaughter, encouraging them to play like a beast. When the hunter is engaged in combat, Bloodborne is undoubtedly a hot medium, forcing the player to dash and slash in reaction to hostile bodies. It has been said countless times that Bloodborne's rallying mechanic forces the player to be more violent in close encounters, rather than being defensive. And as such, the combat tends to demand speed rather than strategy.
I mean, there's a lot about this that I would disagree with, but maybe it's because I'm not entirely familiar with like the hot, cool paradigm shift here of describing video games and whatnot. So I would make the argument that even though there might be some of a reactive element to trying to determine whether to press the attack, that still does take a component of strategy. And then you also have to take that risk, that gamble of trying to determine if the risk of hitting the enemy and not getting hit back in that time period is worth the reward of healing versus trying to manage your blood vials. So I don't know if it's quite that black and white or hot and cold about this after all. All right, Elden enthusiast, you have a good night as well.
The medium heats up, the player's participation
Chadwick
drops,
asks, was Jura a fool as well? I mean, it is literally canonical that he is a fool according to his item descriptions, so yes.
Speed rather than strategy. As the medium heats up, the player's participation drops, allowing them to become a passive receptacle to Bloodborne's visual inputs. In a sense, one lets their muscle memory take hold in combat encounters.
And I do feel like a lot of this is overly reductive because hot might be reactive, sure, but not entirely. Like, it's ludicrous almost to suggest that being in the midst of combat means you do not have the time to think or plan or strategize. Like, literally some of the best boxers in the world are going to be thinking about how their opponents are moving, what they intend to do if they move a certain way. And so I don't know how fair all of these assessments are. So maybe they're a little bit overly reductive.
Trusting that their sense of timing and familiar button inputs will carry them through any obstacle. In this dynamic, the player is reduced to a kind of pure id, following their impulse to dictate the hunter's body. Notably, the hunter's body functions as a weapon for the vast...
I really do like the lighting of the alpha a lot more, I think.
...to dictate the hunter's body. Notably, the hunter's body functions as a weapon for the vast majority of the game, as can be seen by looking at their hands. The only things a hunter can actively carry in their hands are weapons, be it two-handing a trick weapon or bearing a melee weapon in one hand and a gun in another. In this sense, the capacity of the player to interact with the world around them is critically limited to mainly just weapons. Even when unequipping their weapons, the hunter proceeds to use their hands for the exact same purpose, just less efficiently, slashing with their bare hands. And, well, the hunter's legs are there really just to get them from one place of carnage to the next. As such, the hunter is actively presented as a body of domination, their primary means of interacting with other bodies being subjugation and murder. The main style of play fits perfectly into the dilemma of beasthood in Bloodborne, putting to question the hunter's status as a civilized human being. The dissonance of an enlightened Victorian individual with a cane, suit, and a top hat, completely covered in blood and cutting down mobs in the streets, brilliantly emphasizes Bloodborne's concerns with the distinctions of human from animal. This notion is explicitly stated in the note on the bookshelf in Bergenworth. When the red moon hangs low, the line between man and beast is blurred. To become a beast is to let the body take over, to forgo the idea of a mind, going mad in the ecstasy of bloodlust. As the player goes around killing everything in their way, there comes the revelation that the beasts are actually human or people beneath all the fur.
Master said, murder, they attack us. Pastor, I know what you did. I've seen what you do. You go into Old Yarnum when you don't have to, and you murder all the people who still live down there. I've seen it.
The retired hunter Jura tells the player that
in case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people.
this sentiment is also expressed by the cannibal homeless guy when you attack him for eating the survivors of the Odin's Chapel.
Oh, you are.
Mothcrab asks, you can really just skip and not touch Old Yarnum? You always just kind of walked everywhere in Bloodborne without understanding where things leak up? To be fair, it is a little bit more difficult, perhaps arbitrarily so, to avoid Old Yarnum. The way that you would do so is by saving up 10,000 blood echoes to buy the Hunter Chief's emblem and going through the main gate of Cathedral Ward. And that's how you can completely skip Old Yarnum. Because otherwise, you can't advance through the gate, and then you couldn't go up the tower, Odin Chapel Tower, because it's still closed until after you defeat the blood-starved beast. So, yep, that's pretty much the only way.
You attack him for eating the survivors of the Odin's Chapel.
Oh, you are a sick puppy. You drink the blood of half the town, and now this. And you talk of beasts. You hunters are the real killers.
Both of these instances reinforce the uncertainty of what quantifies the status of being human. In their essay, Bloodletting, Seductive Monstrosity and its Interplay Between Waking and Dreaming in Bloodborne, Wilson Borrell identifies the following utility in this ambiguity between human and beast.
The hunter is not only destroying the inhabitants of Yarnum, but the human player as well, given that becoming a monstrous hunter that revels in the destruction of their fellow inhuman inhabitants is satisfying for the competent player. By adopting aggressive play styles, the player interacts with the game on psychological and physical levels. This is not particular to Bloodborne, yet its alleged difficulty requires players to learn the most efficient manner of slaying the various beasts and great ones, lest they do not progress further in the game.
I gotta admit, that art and that transition was badass.
Does the institutional power of the hunter's dream justify the slaughter of people? Who chooses to label the victims of the beast plague as beasts? And how is the hunter any different from the very creatures they exterminate? All these questions and more arise out of the cathartic gameplay of Bloodborne, but the player can only contemplate their own status as a beast while standing atop the already dead bodies of their foes. Because when Bloodborne throws its werewolves at the player, one is forced to react as the game medium heats up, leaving very little room for the player to actually critically contemplate the nature of the bodies in Yarnum. While one could make the claim that the medium of Bloodborne does cool down when interacting with NPCs, this is not the case because the actual engagement with the NPCs at most is listening, not demanding the player to actively participate with them in any meaningful way. In doing so, all bodies in Bloodborne are just things to be literally and metaphorically consumed by the hunter. More on this later. So when does the medium of Bloodborne cool down? I swear we're going to get back to the body horror very soon. Well, Bloodborne is at its coolest only when the hunter has completed their massacres. When the hunter is suddenly confronted with the absence of victims, the hunter has to seek the next step, forcing the player to begin thinking more critically. These moments of frustrated searching are when the player becomes a more active participant of the Bloodborne in McLuhan's sense. Additionally, Bloodborne cools down during its loading screens. While loading, the player is greeted with item descriptions that are arguably the primary means for one to understand what is actually happening in Yarnum. From Software Studios is often praised for their subtle environmental storytelling, be it through the aforementioned item descriptions, extremely vague NPC quotes, and random scenes scattered throughout their settings, and Bloodborne is no exception to this style. This environmental storytelling, fragmented and poetic, is by its nature a cool medium, forcing the player to make their own conclusions about the game rather than being outright told what is happening in Yarnum. As such, the player's most active cerebral participation occurs beyond their own bestial violence, when they are forced to think outside of combat. In Bloodborne, only through the willing engagement with its colder side of the game's medium does the player become more cognitively present within the game. So to comprehend Bloodborne,
And we could also compare that idea to gaining more insight as well. So hopefully that answers your question there, Hilko, about spending hours analyzing each line of dialogue. He's finally getting to that point. So, yeah, okay, I'll just let it go.
the player is forced to slow down and deeply think about its world. Through exploration and personal lore connections, the player slowly begins to see themselves in a broader historical and cosmic context, decentering them from the body of the hunter and allowing them to see themselves as a part of a greater relationship of things in the world. This recentering of the self explicitly occurs when the player first accumulates enough insight. It's an in-game resource acquired by undergoing horrific events and discovering forbidden knowledge. When the hunter attains 40 insight, they become capable of seeing the world as it is, their mind no longer filtering out otherwise incomprehensible terrors, such as the amygdalas. Amygdalas being great ones that linger in the plain sight within the streets of Yharnam, yet are still unseen by humanity. This revelation puts to question the place of humanity in the cosmos, leading to what many in the community have described as a sense of cosmic horror. This described sense of cosmic horror
Gotta check all these out. Hold on.
described as a sense of cosmic horror.
The existential cosmic horror of Bloodborne and how it scared me. Gothic and cosmic horror in Bloodborne. Lovecraft House, the cosmic horror of Bloodborne. Bloodborne, true cosmic horror story.
This described sense of cosmic horror reduces the perceived significance of humanity in the world of Bloodborne, making the player feel arguably smaller and smaller within the scope of the game's world. Now, actually, this notion of human insignificance is explored very, very well by Soul Porpoise in their OTH How Bloodborne Transforms the Myth. The first video essay I've ever watched, and arguably has gotten me into Bloodborne and academia. Please check it out.
That is a good video. I think I reacted to it on stream like a very long time ago. Captini asks, does the world change instantly when you get 40? Like if you're watching a Squid Guy at 39 and then you use Insight Thingy, does it become visible? No, I don't think the game can make those kind of on-the-fly adjustments, and you might need to reload the area, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if touching the lamp works off the top of my head. It's been a long time since I've really had to do like such fine mechanical testing of Bloodborne's mechanics, I guess. Chadwick said, when is FromSoft going to use whip scorpions as scary things? Lots of spiders and insects, no whip scorpions, the most frightening creatures on Earth. What do you mean by a whip scorpion? Does that differ from a normal scorpion? Oh, okay, I see what you mean. They kind of have things a little bit closer to that in Elden Ring. Oh, never mind. I can't talk to you about that, Chadwick. Play and find out, Chadwick.
So, while Bloodborne can be beaten by someone rushing through the whole thing, ignoring all NPCs, clues, and skipping cutscenes, this hot, molten engagement barely involves the player, and if anything, only further contributes to Bloodborne's post-human messages of blurring human civilization and primeval beasthood. Additionally, one can only unlock 2 endings through this kind of engagement, which we will discuss shortly. However, the third, often referred to as the true ending of Bloodborne, can only be accessed through a deep exploration of the game, requiring the player to find 3 pieces of a Great One's umbilical cord and then to make the decision to eat them all. So
this is a common misconception, partially because the North American version of the third umbilical cord description calls it 1/3 of an umbilical cord, something along those lines, whereas the European version and the Japanese versions just say like third umbilical cord, and third is meant in the sense of it being an ordinal number, so first, second, third, as opposed to 1/2, 1/3 of a like larger object. So that isn't entirely relevant, but you all know me. I'm not going to let that stuff go. Here we go.
when the player engages on a more participatory, cooler cognitive level through interpreting the world and poetry of Bloodborne, they open themselves up to the overarching post-human rhetoric of Bloodborne's story, fundamentally changing the way they view the relations of bodies and environments in Yharnam.
Part 3, The Bloodbornean Body.
I should not force your will, but you are a hunter, and we'll see soon enough that on a night of the hunt, no, on any night, nothing out there deserves to live.
So having established how Bloodborne functions as a gallery of human bodily torments,
This part's a little bit louder.
positioned itself as a self-reflective experience for its players, and required the players to think beyond an immediate bodily experience to grasp its overarching context, we can now begin to consider to what end Bloodborne aims its players. By actively desensitizing its players to body horror and portraying essentially all bodies as a resource for achieving a goal, Bloodborne argues that the only way to escape the suffering of humanity is to stop being human. When encountering a new grotesque monster in the streets of Yharnam, the player must feel a variety of emotions, from terror to fascination. For example, seeing Ludwig the Accursed for the first time, for me personally, was a terrifying experience. I mean, the thing is positively revolting. I mean, look at the wet mouth of eye. Yet, the core gameplay loop does not facilitate this horror for very long. As one
That's funny, because that didn't bother me at all. I was like, well, that's just kind of goofy. Could you imagine trying to eat with that? Like, that would suck. That'd be painful. Like, why would this be scary if it tried to eat me with its eyes? They would just get squished and, burst like grapes. That's an Elden Ring reference.
faces Ludwig over and over, the emotional impact of the boss fight reduces dramatically, and over time he becomes just kind of another enemy to be overcome, although a distinctly larger one at that. I mean, don't get me wrong, defeating Ludwig always feels great, but if one does it enough times, it becomes progressively more difficult to view him as disturbing and gross. By the end of the night, the player is intended to become intimately familiar with practically every imaginable contortion of human flesh. And just the sheer amount of blood and gore in this game will inevitably leave most desensitized to itself. Notably, this desensitization relates not just to Bloodborne's environment and its denizens, but also to the notion of the hunter's death. With a boss like Ludwig, unless the player is incredible at the game, one is likely to die far more than once within this encounter.
Yeah, Ludwig was the hardest boss for me in Bloodborne, but that's because when I first played through it was, well, I had to go back to it after like a year it had been out. So the DLC was out at that point, but I didn't beat the base game, so I went back to beat the base game, and I did that and had a blast. So the way for me to experience the DLC, I had to go in on New Game Plus. So I did all of that, fighting Ludwig on New Game Plus with a, pretty standard character for that point, and he messed me up pretty bad, but I eventually got it.
With every death, one cannot help but become numb to the contortion of Ludwig's body, and more accustomed to their own frequent deaths from the safety of the screen. So, what is this then? Poor game design? Is it not a game flaw for the player to care less and less about its imagery? Well, in the case of many other games, this might be considered a critical flaw within the gameplay loop, but not in Bloodborne, which comes down to the way From Software games depict player deaths in general. In their book, A Play on Bodies, How We Perceive Video Games, Brendan Keogh, I hope I'm saying that right, identifies that video game deaths are crucial in understanding the holistic construction of video game stories and player experiences. Keogh says the following on the subject.
Through repetition and failure, multiple pasts and lost futures converge on the present play experience to intermediate each other through muscle memory, genre conventions, retries, game overs, seriality, and wasted time. To play a video game is to overwrite invalidated pasts and to seek at alternative futures. Just as the player does when completing the virtual world, they work to downplay the inauthentic timeline in their desire to experience video game play as holistic and continuous. But these other timelines do exist and contribute to the ongoing video game experience, and they thus must be accounted for.
From Software games such as Bloodborne account for those inauthentic game over timelines through a generally unconventional method of, authenticating them. In Bloodborne, the hunter's inability to permanently die is an explicit power bestowed on them by the cosmic power of the hunter's dream.
Yeah, so on that topic, before I'd played Dark Souls 1, I had been playing with the idea of how cool it would be if there was a video game that essentially made the player level up rather than their character. And then after playing through games like Dark Souls, I realized that that is essentially kind of what happens when you play through them, because you can only really get a first playthrough once unless you're doing a randomizer or something like that. So you essentially level up yourself, your own skills as a player by kind of getting the pattern recognition for each enemies and understanding the layouts of each area. So in a kind of meta way, that is something that I think is pretty cool about the games. That's called Street Fighter? Okay.
As a result, every death of the hunter is a canonical event, with every death contributing to the player's understanding of the environment, and as such being the superpower that gives them the edge over the otherwise unforgiving world of Yharnam. With the hunter's immortality in mind, the hunter in the player's experience gains a kind of meta quality. In a Groundhog Day-styled experience, the player is left to become accustomed to the Bloodborne's horrors to progress through the world. Through frequent exposure to body horror, over time the player stops caring about the threat of unpleasant appearances of flesh around them and the suffering of their own character. Boral identifies this game.
So Chadwick is saying, for Street Fighter, you never get stronger, you get stronger using him. Counterpoint, then why does he get some different moves between the games which makes him more or less viable? Checkmate, atheist.
As of flesh around them and the suffering of their own character. Boral identifies this gameplay feature as one associated with the player becoming more beast-like. They say the following.
The player is meant to cast away their fears in entering the Gothic world with the aim of embracing primal violence, a space dominated and relegated to what may be conceived as the id. The id is, after all, the seat of wanton desire and pleasure.
But while this reading is partially true, it does forgo the player's immortal meta-presence in Yharnam.
I'm going to read that quote again. I'm going to back it up even further.
The player is meant to cast away their fears in entering the Gothic world with the aim of embracing primal violence, a space dominated and relegated to what may be conceived as the id. The id is, after all, the seat of wanton desire and pleasure.
I'll admit that's pretty abstract, and I'm under the impression that the space dominated and relegated to what may be conceived as the id may be a way of saying that whatever the hunter character is experiencing in the game is done in a subconscious liminal realm of existence rather than the quote-unquote waking world beyond it, but I'm not sure.
But while this reading is partially true, it does forgo the player's immortal meta-presence in Yharnam. For the player that has slowed down, done their research, and understood their place in the world of Yharnam, when considering the true ending of Bloodborne, the indulgence in the primal violence for the player is ultimately reframed as a pathway out of both the paradigms of the beast and man. In order to progress, the player must fundamentally change the way they look at bodies in Bloodborne.
Through the hunter's eyes.
As one encounters bodies in Bloodborne, over time the AI behavior becomes formulaic and arguably predictable, allowing the player to quite literally read their enemies. Bloodborne, like most Souls games, relies on the player's ability to understand the physical language of its bodies. Once a player learns to recognize a raise of a Yharnamite's shoulder as an incoming axe strike, or the recoil of a werewolf as a possible grab, they functionally reduce the bodies of Bloodborne to a kind of high-fidelity text to be translated and reacted to. Steadily, the player is made to feel like the master of bodies, predicting behavior of flesh, and as such reducing the bodies to something that can be grasped and mastered on a technical level. But this reframing of bodies in Yharnam goes a step further when one begins to consider the utility of bodies around the hunter. At its core, Bloodborne's gameplay loop consists of exploring an area while murdering all hostiles, finding a boss arena behind a fog wall, destroying the boss, and repeating this process for the duration of the whole game. Gradually, the player defeats greater and greater foes. Bloodborne is all about the triumph over the great obstacles, yet frequently one runs into obstacles that are too great to be overcome from the first try. This halting of progress leads the player towards reevaluating their resources at hand, searching for anything that might give them the edge to transcend the given obstacle.
I don't know how to make animations. The hunter finds more blood vials and goes through the brick wall. Use your imagination here. Okay. I was going to say that I really liked the transparent effect on the hunter as well.
Mindset steadily leads the player to look at Bloodborne's denizens not as living, but rather as useless or useful flesh. An example of this flesh utility motif can be seen even before the game begins. The waste of flesh character creation option wonderfully demonstrates Bloodborne's rhetoric, as such a term implies that there is an ultimate function in flesh. So certain flesh has value and purpose, while on the other hand some flesh is a waste of a substance. This utility is framed in relation to the completion of the game, as the waste of flesh background initially makes the game experience more difficult in comparison to the other character background options that make the hunter more suitable to their ultimate task of transcending the hunt. Useful flesh is a kind of resource flesh that relates to the hunter by its capacity to have utility. For example, most enemies can be hacked apart to restore the hunter's health through the rallying mechanic. Enemies can also drop valuable items like quicksilver bullets or blood vials, without which most players simply could not beat the game. Or they can provide blood echoes through which the player can purchase items or become more powerful through leveling up. While resource flesh does include NPCs with dialogue, the majority of this resource flesh can be interacted with only through its suffering. If there is still any doubt about Bloodborne training its player to look at flesh as a personal resource, one must only think about the college student trying to get into the job market outside of Ludwig's arena. All jokes aside, I think about this little guy a lot. Generally, the player does not kill it out of pity. Maybe one does it the first time, but what pushes one to do it for the 20th time? That's right, just the blood vials contained in its frame. Through its gameplay loop, Bloodborne has incentivized its players to kill this suffering, skinless person so many times that eventually the player would see it no longer as a person, but just as blood vials.
So for any of you who haven't really played Bloodborne or who have forgotten, this little bro, this Skeller bro, drops 5 blood vials every time you kill him, and he just happens to be somewhat on the way to one of the hardest bosses in the game. So in addition to dropping 5 blood vials, it's like the highest guaranteed drop of like any monster in the game essentially, and is one of the best farming spots that doesn't rely on obtaining blood echoes to purchase blood vials at the shop from. So yeah, this dude just kind of gets farmed by a lot of players.
Eventually the player would see it no longer as a person, but just as blood vials. In terms of useless flesh, on the other hand.
So Hilko asked which monster that was. So he's the little dude at the gate next to the ice cream scooper lady on the way to Ludwig.
Bloodborne very frequently portrays human bodies as a part of the environment that holds no value to the player. I do not simply mean the countless gravestones we encounter throughout the game, but rather the corpses littering the massive environments of Bloodborne. In my first playthrough, I completely missed the thousands of bodies in the streets of Yahar'gul. I thought they were just some flowers scattered around. But how did I miss such a staggering amount of corpses?
That's amazing.
Other than me not paying close attention, Bloodborne's high-definition textures can often be difficult to discern from each other. One could argue this instance is an example of Bloodborne's capacity to desensitize. Like the skulls in the catacombs of Paris, the environment is so overwhelmed with the human bodies that any individual instance of a skull becomes the norm and even no longer registers as such. Because of this, the value of a human body becomes reduced to the worth of pebbles in the road, except you can actually use pebbles in Bloodborne, unlike those bodies. So, returning back to body horror, it is such a crucial element of Bloodborne because it highlights all the ways in which human flesh is unstable, showing how humans can change and always do throughout their lives. Through witnessing constant body horror, one is forced to acknowledge the malleability and impermanence of flesh as a whole. Meat, a kind of breathing clay, is actively presented as grotesque in Bloodborne, with arguably every living being to some degree in a state of torment. Most of the time, life in Yharnam is presented as ugly and painful, so much so that I cannot think of a single good thing Bloodborne portrays about being human on its surface. By portraying the body in such a grim, nightmarish light, Bloodborne actively scorns the human condition while condemning those who attempt to change it, such as Lawrence, the first vicar. And so there we have it, the Bloodbornian body, a grotesque suffering resource made to be mastered by the player through violence. But what is the rhetoric of the Bloodbornian body?
So I will admit, I think Methodus said this a little bit earlier, that the academics seems to be getting a little bit lost in the weeds, that at this point in the video, I've kind of forgotten it's meant to be about body horror specifically, which I guess the skull point lines up well, but some of this other stuff with the flesh, I'm just kind of forgetting the site of the thesis at the moment.
What message does this depiction of the body contribute to? To find the answer, we must look at the hunter's final goal, the end of Bloodborne.
On the Stairs of Flesh. So I'm assuming that this is also an oblique reference to the DLC story trailer for Shadow of the Erdtree, because it looks like Marika ascends Stairs of Flesh, and this only came out a couple weeks ago. So that Horns, you're saying you don't know? The Phantasms seem like they're having a good time? Because we all know how human the Phantasms are. Okay.
As mentioned previously, Bloodborne's gameplay loop leads one to a kind of any obstacle can be overcome mentality. Most of everything the player does is done towards ultimately triumphing over the game. However, in doing so, everything that prevents the player from achieving their goal of beating the game becomes an obstacle. This reduction of things to obstacles is especially true for hostile bosses. Bodies are generally framed as something that overcomes the player, or the player overcomes them. This mindset of continual striving for perseverance over adversity leads the player to Bloodborne's primary argument. What is really the thing that the player is set to defeat by the game? Well, when we consider Bloodborne's constant representation of body horror, death, and general suffering, one realizes the true obstacle before the player is really the human condition itself. So now would be a good time to actually look at the endings of Bloodborne to see what all the bodies of Yharnam have been sacrificed for. The three endings of Bloodborne can be read as follows: the death of knowledge, the death of agency, and of course the death of humanity.
Hold on.
Death of knowledge.
The death of knowledge.
The death of agency, and of course...
It's tragic. I think I have a typo in my big video about Bloodborne as well.
The death of humanity.
Ending one.
I will show you mercy. You will die, forget the dream, and awake under the morning sun.
In this first ending, the human subject still continues to survive in the world of Bloodborne. In theory, the hunter forgets the horrors they have witnessed, and they get to see the sunrise over Yharnam. Yet the horrors do not go anywhere. They remain as the intrinsic part of the human experience that Bloodborne argues for with its meditation on body horror. We cannot know anything outside of the human body, and as such must be content with the suffering of the human condition. In doing so, the protagonist serves the goals of the Moon Presence, the Great One in control of the hunter's dream, which the hunter remains oblivious to in this ending. And indeed, mortal agony continues to go on, orchestrated by forces beyond human control.
Ending 2. Actual peak.
In
Best
the second
game ever
ending,
made.
You deny Gurman and have a glorious battle, only to then see the Moon Presence and literally get put in a wheelchair, made to indefinitely watch over the hunter's dream as he had before you. Here, you get to exist outside of humanity, functionally dead to the world, although now yourself spared from the horrors of flesh, no longer experiencing them personally. One could read this also as practically analogous to death. In the end, the human condition remains the same, but now you are consciously serving a great one, aware of your puppet strings, yet unable to do anything about them. In both the first ending and the second ending, all the pain endured by the player is made meaningless as absolutely nothing changes. The world is terrible and our damnation continues. But then, of course, Bloodborne has its third ending. But first, a little bit on blood echoes. Through Bloodborne, as the hunter traverses Yharnam, they accumulate blood echoes, essentially a form of currency one attains from blood of their fallen foes. These blood echoes are the only means by which the player is able to upgrade the stats of the hunter, and as such, the hunter progressively becomes a more powerful being from the consumption of others. By the end of the game, the hunter is likely significantly stronger from the power of all those whom they have killed in their past. As such, the hunter becomes a vessel of bodies, an entity containing the potential of hundreds if not thousands of bodies they have consumed in their quest. Much like the one reborn and attempted creating a great one out of countless human bodies, the hunter functions as an amalgam of mortal bodies striving towards godhood. While one could argue that humankind is consolidated within the body of the hunter by the end of the game, thereby centering the player experience on a singular body, the hunter's body is really a product of a network of bodies, environments, and items that enable a post-human transcendence. At this point, to help reframe Bloodborne and its true ending, I would like to show you an artwork by the artist A.O. Jimbo. Genuinely a masterpiece that encapsulates the core experience of Bloodborne. While the imagery of Michelangelo's creation of Adam has been widely used by the game's community for fan content, of all these depictions, only one truly gets to the core of Bloodborne. Here, the hunter stands upon a mass of the writhing, clawing, and biting bodies, while reaching up to the heavens, either trying to escape their beastly existence or drag the hunter back down into the nightmare of mortal flesh. Yet despite all the horror of their foundation, the hunter still reaches up to the hand of a Great One. The Great One is inhuman above the hunter, not entirely in frame, symbolizing its incomprehensible Lovecraftian nature. And when compared to Michelangelo's creation of Adam, the hand gestures are reversed between God and man. In the world of Bloodborne, it is the man that reaches beyond all of their physical limitations to reach God, and it is the hand of God that is limp and uncaring of man's existence, perfectly nailing the cosmic horror of this Victorian nightmare. The hunter's only two options are to transcend beyond or fall into the painful darkness of flesh. The hunter walks upon the sad flesh of others to transcend the mortal state, and as such, the bodies of Bloodborne can be read as the stairs of suffering flesh towards the post-human future.
Mothcrab asked, which OST was that? I wasn't paying enough attention, but toward the end it sounded like the Cleric Beast theme.
So, the final ending.
I mean, I was paying attention to the video, not so much like what specific track was playing. Ending 3. So I am glad that he brought up the blood echoes. I was wondering if he's going to get to that point anywhere in the essay. I think it's interesting to argue that the blood and blood echoes are of the body first, when I think it's supposed to be a little bit more transcendent than that. But I guess within the context of this essay and the whole Nietzschean quote towards the beginning about the soul being of the body, I will kind of begrudgingly let that go.
You feast on the umbilical cords of a Great One, get to battle the Moon Presence, and against all Lovecraftian odds, basically kill Cthulhu. As a result, you become an infant Great One yourself, a little squid. The PlayStation achievement states as follows. You become an infant Great One, lifting humanity into its next childhood. Through the sacrifice of humanity, the player brings about the end of the human, instead giving birth to the post-human. Bloodborne does not show what such an existence is going to be like, only affording a glimpse of the post-human self. The third-person camera slowly distances itself from the little squid body, symbolizing an expanding scope of godly cognition. And then the game cuts to black, and it justifies all the death and pain experienced throughout the game. It reframes those countless slaughtered bodies as a necessary component for a greater state of being, a greater purpose. And so from the perspective of Bloodborne's third ending, the body is purely the mortar towards a quest of justifying why the human condition was ever necessary in the first place. So, through its horrific representations of bodies, decentering of the player's experience, and portrayal of flesh as a resource, Bloodborne reduces the human body to a volatile material that must be reshaped at all cost, lest it devours itself.
A point of view can be a dangerous luxury when substituted for insight and understanding.
Consolation.
Alright, before we part ways, I would like to give a word of consolation for Sarah. While Bloodborne's incredibly anti-human themes are inseparable from the game, one must remember that while Bloodborne holds a degree of truth regarding the human condition, it is ultimately an artistic expression of horror and is by no means a one-to-one simulacre of reality. In Bogost's sense, to enter the digital world of Bloodborne is to allow the laws of its artists to become reality in place of the laws of the real world. When one begins to really think about the events of Bloodborne, what options are there? In Bloodborne, the only choice is to suffer through an unending nightmare or to just cease being human. But while Bloodborne offers its players a uniquely dark perspective on being human, which one might argue to be true due to its pessimism, a perspective is only that, a perspective. The cerebral, scholarly engagement with Bloodborne's body, while thought-provoking, fails to account for the mode of being in one's body. One cannot taste, feel, or smell in the world of Bloodborne. At its core, Bloodborne's post-human narrative is about becoming something rather than just being. And the body, while horrific, is also our only way of enjoying this life. But things that make life worth living are mostly absent in Yharnam, and due to Bloodborne's nature as a linear story game, no matter how many times we come back to the streets of Yharnam, its morbid reality will never change. Ironically, despite all its condemnations of the body, Bloodborne ultimately presents its combat, the most beastly physical act the hunter can engage in, as also the most physically pleasurable for the player themselves. It is the act that situates the player most of all in their own body, through their controller, and allows them to experience the little joy there is to be found in the world of Bloodborne. While the raw physical existence is full of horror, it also has its joys. Bloodborne will forever remain a wasteland shrouded in eternal night, a dream of decay and existential dread. Yet, on the other hand, our living bodies get to see and feel the sunrise every morning, and perhaps having journeyed through the night, the dawns are now that much brighter. So I guess, before I get too cheesy, what I'm really trying to say is, don't think about it too hard and don't really take it too seriously. Just go out and kill a few beasts. It's just
Who said it earlier? Was it without horns? There you go.
what hunters do.
On the Stairs of Flesh, how Bloodborne transcends body horror.
Well, it's fine.
Okay, so I'm a little bit surprised he didn't bring it back to the Great Ones and their desiring for children and things like that. That even if you transcend the limits of the body, that doesn't necessarily mean you transcend the mentality of the body or the human mind. And so there might be something very sinister lurking behind the implication that all of the Great Ones who have allegedly transcended humanity or, you know, existed in a place beyond humanity, that they would covet that which humanity has if they do not, I think is pretty unsettling in a bit of a meta-narrative shift there. Oh, it was Methoda. Okay. Validated. Hilka said, in your opinion, Bloodborne does the most overt job at essentially pulling down all that non-body thinking. Methoda said, for them, the biggest body horror in Bloodborne was the bloodstones. You don't like the idea of stones in your blood? Fair enough. And so Chadwick said earlier, they never interpreted blood echoes as being consumed by us. We give them to the doll, and she converts their strength onto us. We take in the blood vials. But you just didn't say anything after that, really. Okay. Aliens built Yharnam? They did. Okay, let's go into the credits.
Finally over. This essay has been brewing in my mind for maybe the last 4 years, and with the 10th year anniversary, this seemed like just the perfect time to finally get it done. I've always wanted to somehow contribute to the Bloodborne's community, and seeing how much it changed my life, this really kind of felt good to get off my chest. For me, this also kind of became a personal meditation and confrontation with the arguments of Bloodborne about being human. Ultimately, getting to put it all into words has been just a deeply therapeutic experience, and I'm definitely looking forward to slightly less grim essays in the near future. I was definitely not alone in the creation of this video, so I would really like to give credit where credit is due. So, big thanks to Raymond McDowell for his incredible narration of the quotes. He's got a YouTube channel, please go check it out. Massive thank you to Sound Phenomenon for letting me use their music within this video. Please check out their Mercurial score. It's an entire fan-made soundtrack for Bloodborne. Like, really great stuff. I think you'll love it. And additionally, thank you goes to Crystal109 for letting me use their gameplay footage within this video. Like, I think it is like really great gameplay. Check out their channel. I really couldn't do without it. Also, thank you to my partner Abigail and good friend Earl Grey Tea for helping me brainstorm for this essay. And thank you, Dr.
I just like the idea of them thanking literally Earl Grey Tea rather than a channel titled Earl Grey Tea, because it's a little bit funnier to me.
Kreider for your assistance with securing me the resources and time to create this project within your class. Oh, and of course, thank you all so much for your positive feedback on the Cyberpunk essay. It did so much better than I ever expected it to, and the support in the comments was just incredibly encouraging for the production of this video essay. There will definitely be more video essays to come, so if you're interested in monsters, body horror, and other media-related topics, please feel free to stick around and maybe even subscribe. So again, thank you everyone, and happy 10th anniversary. Have a good one, comrades.
Fudge. Bloodborne's been out for 10 years? Ah, that means my one video is like 5 years old, which means I'm old. That sucks. Anyway, that was an enjoyable video, so here you go, guys. It is in chat if you want to give Comrade Analysis some support. Seems like they may be a newer / smaller channel. They only have 1.1k subs right now. So they only have the 2 videos. So, yeah, they said that they're going to make more, at least on the topics of body horror. I'm not so interested in that. If there was like more FromSoft stuff, I would consider subscribing right now. But maybe you guys are more interested in that than I am. So anyway, I went ahead and liked the video. And let's see what you guys were saying in the meantime there. Chadwick, you don't think that the blood echoes are physical at all? You don't see consuming them any more blood than the transfusions of the blood vials? Okay. You just think Bloodborne is the least physical of the FromSoft games? It just wears the skin of blood and flesh, but that isn't at all what it's about. Great video, though. Well done stuff. You just disagree. I kind of agree with you to an extent, I believe, that Bloodborne tends to be a little bit more metaphysical with that stuff. Blood echoes seem like they can come from anything. I don't know about anything. My interpretation about things like the crows, the dogs, and the krogs, and the man-eater pigs is that they probably are carrion beasts, and so blood echoes probably came from humans, essentially, but more specifically the dead, because they're called like dying wills of blood, essentially, so yeah. Or dead blood, essentially, as well. Pastor, you think they're just dried blood? Au contraire. Cold blood is said to not coagulate, which is kind of what separates it from normal blood. So if anything, it's wet blood. Oh, you think the bloodstones are dried blood. Yeah, that's a little bit more fair. Methoda said the bloodstones are a thing that come from the great ones, though, right? It's not a natural thing in world. Same with the blood echoes. A normal human wouldn't drop any. So humans definitely would drop blood echoes, but bloodstones are what you get in cold blood that doesn't stay liquefied. So in addition to the bloodstones, you have alternative blood gems, which seem to be like a more concentrated form of like blood echoes that can be used for specific functions when drilled into weapons, essentially. So I think essentially you are augmenting your weapons with the Bloodborne equivalent of souls and whatnot. Okay, let's go ahead and check out the next video of the night with Death in Elden Ring Shadow of the Erd Tree by A Human Just a Car. And I probably need to turn down the sound real quick before we all lose our collective hearing. So give me a moment. Because that last one was quiet indeed. Indeed.
Welcome to a spooky Halloween bonus video. Happy Halloween, everyone. Today's topic is all about
It's Halloween.
one thing. Welcome to a spooky Halloween bonus video. Happy Halloween, everyone. Today's topic is all about one thing, and it's one of the main themes found in Elden Ring, and that's death, which right off the bat feels super spooky. But as we all know, death is simply one part of the natural order. But in the lands between, the natural order has been disrupted when Queen Marika removed the Rune of Death and sealed it away inside her very own shadow. But while death was taken away from the lands between, traces of it can still be found deep in the hidden realm of shadow, where all manners of death wash up. Even the pathway to the realm of shadow is through Mikola the Kind's withered corpse. But what did death look like before Queen Marika sealed it away? The Shadow Realm opens up upon a vast area known as the Gravesite Plains, and there we can find gravestones, both young and old. Spirit gravestones litter the ground, signifying this as the place to where the dead have been brought since antiquity, or ancient times. The oldest manner of death is going to predate the Erd Tree, and for that, we don't have to look any further than the Deathbirds. In the time when there was no Erd Tree, death was burned in ghost flame, and Deathbirds were the keepers of that flame. Death's Poker describes the Deathbirds raking out the ashen remains of the dead from kilns, and we know that these ashen remains can still retain the spirits of those who've passed on. In the realm of shadow, we find revered spirit ashes.
So this is something that I've looked at again more recently and was surprised to see how I had overlooked something. Give me a second here. So while I would say that she's correct that the dead can remain in ashes in the form of spirit ashes and whatnot, I would differentiate those types of spirit ashes from what's going on with Ghost Flame and the Deathbird specifically. Unless you want to make the claim that all of the remains that we find at the end of catacombs and whatnot, where we get the spirit ashes from most of the time, were all burned in ghost flame before they were put at the roots of the Erd Tree, which just doesn't quite read so accurately to me. This will be a little bit of a how do I want to say it? A scenic trip, so bear with me here. Wait, prisoners? Prisoner. Oh, okay. It's not possessive. So the prisoner Iron Mask says, it's a foul creation designed to torment the wearer, either slowly fermenting hatred within their heart or a spiritual fervor that is near indistinguishable from it. So this spiritual fervor, as it happens to be in Japanese, comes from our ubiquitous term ishi, like the greater will type ishi, or, well, the greater will type will. And what it's saying is, like, the hatred that it foments is essentially a will that comes to resemble hatred. And I knew about this discrepancy for a long time, but it seemed so inconsequential that I just didn't really think too much of it. But I'm like, Ishi comes up here in this context, which is just kind of a little bit strange, but okay, whatever. And then I forgot about it for a very long time. So I just happened to be looking back into this as I was looking into things related to sinning. And for anybody who's like, what's this have to do with sinning? A part of that is because, like, the term as far as like crime and whatnot has the character tsumi, which means sin. So like sin, guilt, those type of things are all related. And why is this important that I'm bringing up this stupid concept of Ishi, this willpower type stuff? As we were talking about Bloodborne and wills being in the blood, like that's what death blood is, the dying wills of blood, essentially. If will can equal hatred, then that might actually be a pretty good indicator of what's going on with curses, because I don't know what text I'm looking for specifically. I'm just kind of winging it here, so bear with me. I'm going to type in Onyo. Oh, that Ranker is what it's called in English. I need familial rancor, I think. I feel like I'm blind. Okay. Rancor call. So, okay, yeah. In this context, in Ancient Death Rancor, which pertains to the Death Birds, they would rake out the cinders of death from, like, the ashes, essentially. And to me, the cinders are what the Rancor are. So, something which does not burn properly in Ghost Flame is what remains. And then those remnants are the Rancor that we cast with those spells specifically. And with that being tied to hatred, that might ultimately tie into the willpower. Because if the spirit gets destroyed by the rancor and all that's left are these kind of negative feelings, so familiar rancor makes it a bit more explicit. The anguish of a spouse and children invites accursed wrath. Maybe that doesn't work super well as far as the English is concerned. But I mean, it's close enough. Um, so, long story short, if curses aren't necessarily related to true spirits, but they're like negative emotions, and then we learned that the willpower can resemble a negative emotion, then are rancors type things a byproduct of strong wills? As it turns out, that actually ties into Roger's dialogue about how does he phrase it? Flaw in the order? Okay. You may find this peculiar, but I discovered something in my examination of the Night of the Black Knives. These souls have committed no offense. They have every right to life, only they happen to touch upon a flaw in the order. Yes, indeed. If thee knew what drives me now, blah, 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 blah. Does he talk about it here, or is it a different text? No, Kenmei Niiki. Okay. How does it go? They have every right to life, only they happen to touch upon and fall in the order. Oh, yeah, that's right. He just kind of doesn't really hit on this in the English. So, he says, like, they've committed no offense. However, they just try to live, like, earnestly. And because of that, they've come into contact with a flaw, defect in the order. So, this Kenmei Niiki, Kenmei, like, is earnestly. So if they keep trying to live earnestly, it's like, what the hell does that mean? It has to pertain to willpower. And why was this explicit to me with Roger? I think it was because of something with Fia. I know I talk about this all the time. Does he bring up Ishii here? Is this right for him? Yeah, it should be. No. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sophia talks about how Roger's, like, mind anchors his will. Oh, yeah, I forgot about this, huh? His thoughts anchor his mind. Or his thoughts anchor his will. So if soul equals thought, then if you're soulless, your will is just kind of wandering. Maybe. And then yeah, your like vital force, your living force is your willpower, as far as Fia's text is concerned. So what were we talking about in the video which inspired this tangent? Oh yeah, yeah. The whole fact that Rancor might be tied to will specifically is something that I've kind of reconsidered very recently. So the spirit ashes, I think, are meant to have their souls and stuff, because you literally have the character for soul within spirit ashes. But that's why I think Ghost Flame is different. So Ghost Flame destroys the soul or frees the soul, or just destroys the body so the soul can like leave it. And then that which remains is the angry will that's left behind, because you have resentment in your heart. And those who live in death, I believe, have an excess of willpower. Oh, is it one of those ghosts? It probably is, refusing the Erdtree's call. I don't think it's like super explicit. To refuse the Erdtree's call to return to live within death is sickening. I thought there was something a little bit more explicit about having the will, maybe pertaining to Roger, but I can't remember. If I think about it, I'll bring it back up. So hopefully that wasn't too scatterbrained for you guys.
And we know that these ashen remains can still retain the spirits of those who've passed on. In the realm of shadow, we find revered spirit ashes, which is said to quietly accumulate in the palm of withered corpses, which are called tutelary deities. I find this really interesting because, again, the entryway to the realm of shadow is through Miquella's withered corpse, and more specifically, we touched his withered hand. Cremation is by far the most popular form of afterlife care in Japan, and its traces lead back to Buddhism. Cremation was thought to be transformative and helps disperse the pollution created after a person dies, successfully moving the spirit into the ancestral realm, from a polluting spirit to a purified ancestral spirit. This idea of pollution versus purification makes me think of the congealed putrescence, or what remains of the impure lives kept within the stone coffins, versus the ancestral spirits, which are also connected to death. But back to the deathrite birds. Maybe it's just me, but I've long thought that deathrite birds resembled vultures. Vultures are scavenger birds who feast on carrion or carcasses. From features like their featherless heads to their large dark-colored wings, and of course their connection to death, I've long wondered if vultures were the inspiration for the deathrite birds. Then this year, introduced in the DLC, were enemies known as grave birds, which I feel like only further fueled this idea of mine. The grave birds appear all across the coastline and in the plains of the realm of shadow. They're stone golems which act as spirit grave keepers. They fly with wings of stone and spout ghost flame.
You know what? It just occurs to me, we never got a reference to Ravenmount in the DLC either, so maybe we're going to get a second DLC.
According to legend, the grave birds were crafted to be kindred to the death birds. The gravebird armor tells us that the armor is stone with a tinge of green, and the feathers resemble those on the gravebirds themselves. I found these gorgeous images of white-rumped vultures online, and they have this lovely green tinge to their outer feathers. And take a look at some of these statues that are found nearby the gravebirds. They are almost identical to vultures. Visually, I find them to be so similar, from their physical appearance to even how they perch or open their wings. Vultures are strongly associated with sky burials, which was also practiced by Buddhists, mainly those in Tibet. This is yet another connection to Buddhism and death.
Without Horns asks Ravenmount. Maybe I'm misremembering the name, but the Raven Assassin. What's it called? Yeah, no, Bloody Finger Ravenmount Assassin. So when you're doing the Yura questline, you will fight him next to Rhea Lucaria's gate. A Human Just a Car interview next. I wasn't really intending on continuing the whole interview format a whole lot. So I thought about this, and yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, I couldn't think of how to articulate it very well. So, well, a part of me really would be interesting in continuing to like interview a bunch of like Soulsborne creators and stuff. I wouldn't want to inadvertently create like an in-group, out-group experience and only like interview people that I like, or um, ignore people that I'm either unaware of or am just not as interested in interviewing. So I don't know. Like maybe if like the content ever took off like a crazy way, I'd consider it more seriously. But I just don't want to necessarily become like a bit of a wedge or create more of a clique in the lore community in general. Although I think it is kind of nice that a lot of the barriers between content creators are coming down a bit more. And then Chadwick asks, does anybody know what a Lammergeier is? I've never heard of that. Global says, Ratatosker interview? I wonder what we would talk about if I were to interview Ratatosker. Probably like Shadow the Erdtree stuff. He does a lot more just like generic game stuff than I realized, to be honest. Oh, Lammergeier is a mech in AC6. See, I'm pretty bad with names. I don't even remember if I can recall any specific unit names in AC6 other than Raven and Rusty and Iguazu and Handler Walter, although he's not a unit. So the funny thing is, because I always called her Jane Eyre, I almost thought her name was Jane for a second and said, and Jane. No, it's Eyre. The Lammergeier is known as the Bone Eater bird or a bone vulture. Oh, okay. Chadwick is talking real world birds. Okay, cool. My grandfather was a pretty avid bird watcher. I thought it was boring as hell. But that may have only been because, like, when I saw him doing it, it was mostly from, like, his kitchen window overlooking the backyard and stuff, rather than, like, going out and seeing more exotic birds and whatnot.
In the realm of shadow, deathbirds and deathrite birds appear in Caro's hidden grave. This region is clearly distinguished by its vivid red flora, and the tall red flowers resemble a real-life flower.
I was about to bring that up, okay.
Known as the red spider lily, Lycoris radiata, or higanbana in Japanese. They're a common flower in Japan whose name is derived from the word higan, which means another beach. This actually calls back to the line,
Death Stranding, anyone?
all manners of death wash up here, as if they've washed up onto another beach.
Another way to think about it could be like another shore. So that's another pretty common way that I think that gets localized, where if you have references to the other shore, it could be the implication of crossing like the Sanzu River, which is meant to separate the realms of like life and death. And you do have some kind of that imagery pop up in media at times. Like if you guys have watched Spirited Away, when Chihiro or Sen like and her family cross the threshold between like the physical world and the spiritual world, you have like the Torii gates, which like signifies that they're going into like a more spiritual area, but like on the way into the village, like it's dry, but as she's leaving, you see like it get flooded. So that's supposed to be like a reference to the Sansu River, I guess, and stuff like that.
Many people interpret this to mean the afterlife, which makes sense, and the flower is strongly associated with graves, since they are toxic and were often planted in grave sites to deter animals from digging up bodies.
And so the Higanbana is essentially synonymous with death, or essentially crossing over. So if you ever see this lily show up in like a something that you're watching, that's kind of what it's supposed to represent visually, which isn't going to be so obvious to people who don't know what it's about. I'm pretty sure this shows up a lot in Demon Slayer's either opening or the ending for the first season, but that's pretty much all that I watched. So anyway.
Another flower that takes on the same shape is the ghost flame bloom, a blue incorporeal version of the higanbana consisting of literal ghost flames. It burns without so much as a sound. There is a saying in Eastern culture that ghosts don't walk on dry land. And indeed, in Japanese culture, ghost flame or ghost lights burn particularly on rainy days. I feel like Elden Ring really captured this idea in the atmosphere of both the Cerulean coastline and the Hidden Grave, where it rains a lot. And then there are the gravekeepers themselves. Tibia is the oldest of gravekeepers, and it's a fitting name since all of the gravekeepers appear to be skeletons. The old gravekeepers are boatmen, or mariners. This is likely a reference to the Greek chthonic god Charon. Charon is often referred to as the boatman or the ferryman, and would transport souls of the dead to the underworld across the river Styx.
Bro, that looks excruciating. I never really stopped to just watch the Tibia Mariner, so for it, like, to spend its afterlife essentially trying to go over one rock as it's rowing its boat and failing miserably just seems terrible. Like, the grave cricket item description does not make a good case for them either, because they're so damn lonely. They throw crickets at the ground and stuff. It's pretty bad. Radical off-road boating. Well, I would certainly hope that you do off-road boating. Like, could you imagine doing on-road boating? That'd be an experience as well.
Transport souls of the dead to the underworld across the river Styx. The design of his boat is what's known as a skiff, or a really flat boat that's close to the water, and it features a spot to sit. The mariners in Elden Ring also appear to be using skiffs. Caro's hidden grave also sounds like a nod to the ferryman, Charon. Caro, Charon. Or maybe it's just the way I'm pronouncing it. What do you guys think? It seems that death was also once ushered to the realm of shadow by these boatmen. But what about the stone coffins that line the Cerulean coastline? Those who drift to the realm of shadow in the stone coffins ultimately become congealed putrescence, bruise-colored ooze, an impure amalgamation of all that remains of the dead corpses once stored inside the coffins, unable to find peace in the afterlife. Those who drifted to the realm of shadow in these stone coffins definitely were handed a very poor fate. Like I mentioned earlier, there is some underlying juxtaposition between the purified soul released through cremation and the impure lives of those whose bodies were left to rot, ooze, and eventually congeal from inside the stone coffins. Perhaps it's because they came to...
So, I don't know if she's going to bring it up later, but one of the putrescence descriptions said that, like, even in the past, even tainted flesh was burned in ghost flame, and then that might be what led to the creation of putrescence, but I digress.
the realm of shadow without a guide. Without a way to be released from these stone coffins, they were abandoned there and had no choice but to eventually rot and become congealed putrescence. This actually leads us to Saint Trina, who is found in the stone coffin fissure. And now, after the events of the DLC, she is very much connected to death. All tainted flesh eventually becomes putrescence, and this clump imbibed Saint Trina's nectar, which granted it eternal rest. Eternal rest is a euphemism for death. It's almost like Saint Trina.
It is, but I think in this case, the whole aspect about curses being tied to feelings of resentment and hatred and things like that keeps them sustained in a state beyond death because they cannot rest, like literally. So, of course, it is a euphemism for death, but I think it's also meant a bit more literally as far as the putrescence goes. So it's kind of in a never-lasting state of torment because it can't let go of its negative emotions. And so once it was able to imbibe St. Trina's nectar or whatever it's called, it was able to temporarily let go of that hatred and find a form of rest, which is why it chooses to serve St. Trina and all that kind of thing. And so that also ties back into Fia and the Baldekin's blessing, because that's probably something I should add to the damn bingo card, Baldekin's blessing instead of Melena's eyes, because in death there can only be peace, because in death there is no emotion or no sensation. Well, how does it say it? I'm surprised I don't have it memorized at this point, to be honest. In death there's only peace, for in death there can be no sensation. So the way that I look at that item description is that because things like putrescence and curses are constantly feeling things, they're obviously not in a state of no sensation, so they're cursed to live in agony, and they're not properly dead. So there are multiple aspects of undeath in Elden Ring. We've talked about this quite a lot recently. We've got those lost in death, which seem different from those who live in death, because those lost in death need guidance, but it seems as though those who live in death would reject guidance because they want to live regardless, because they want to live earnestly in death, as per Roger's Japanese dialogue, and the fact that the one ghost outside the Super North catacombs in Limgrave says, like, they refuse the Erdtree's call to return. To live in death is sickening. So putrescence being the way that it is, I think, is because the will sustains it. And with Fia taking the excess will from champions to craft into the Baldekin's blessings, I think just kind of ties all of these concepts together pretty nicely. Chadwick, there's a gym near you called Sisyphus because the logo's a man rolling a rock uphill. You think they got spooked by calling the gym Sisyphus because the word says sissy? I was wondering if that'd be the rationale. Or maybe it's calling you a sissy for not going in.
Trina has become this new type of guide, the way that the death birds, the deathrite birds, and the gravekeepers once were. She is now able to grant peace in the afterlife to those impure lives in the stone coffins. Someone strongly associated with Saint Trina is Tialier. His meek sadness and
that might tie back into the horn scent as well. Impure lives can't pass on. That makes sense. Because we do have the curse blades, so only the horn scent who let go of their bodies, the tutelary deities, were able to pass on properly, it seems. Because everything else is tainted. I think that tracks. Which might be why we have so many horn scent ghosts who were deleted by Mesmer, at least their bodies.
Wish to endlessly drift in St. Trina's sleep makes me think that Tialier might have been written to represent taking one's own life. His words betray his willingness to go to the edge of his death and beyond just to reach St. Trina. I would sacrifice everything just to gaze upon her one last time. He warns us not to imbibe her nectar since it instantly results in our death, and yet he's done so himself. I am adrift in sleep so that I may hear St. Trina's lost voice.
My man is a professional sleep talker. It's crazy, the dedication to the craft.
It's giving almost this Romeo-Juliet type situation, where he is so desperate to be reunited with St. Trina that he's willing to take his own life. Just take a look at Tialier's concoction. It's a condensed, sleep-inducing elixir that for an ordinary mortal, a single sip would surely result in a swift and certain death. Tialier thought of St. Trina's sleep when he created this, but the ebony sleep he concocted had neither the sweetness of nectar nor the gentleness of rest's embrace. A single sip would grant a swift death and nothing more. Now, I couldn't make this video about death without talking about the Prince of Death himself. Or could I? If you guys want to see a full-length Godwin video, let me know down in the comments because his topic is just way too big for this short little video. Once locked away, destined death is now unleashed, granting death indiscriminate to all those who dwell in the lands between. I hope you enjoyed this spooky special video. Let me know any other connections to death that you've identified in the realm of shadow down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join to become a member on my channel. And as always, you guys, I can't wait to talk to you all in the next one. Happy Halloween!
Okay, so
Created this.
that was a good video. I do have some disagreements, obviously, but nonetheless, it's thought-provoking and tries to stay pretty close to the text and doesn't really go with a bunch of unsupported claims for the most part. So I've gone ahead and shared a Human Justicar's video in chat with you guys. I've gone ahead and liked it myself, and I'm already subscribed to the channel. So I feel like I'm forgetting something else. Anyway, that is actually the last video that I had queued up for the night, surprisingly enough. So I think to kill a little bit of time, I'll talk about the plans for tomorrow and going forward a little bit with the streams. So I don't know who all gets access to like these community posts. I kind of unironically hate community posts, not so much from the standpoint of a creator, but from the standpoint of a user. So anyway, long story short, the other day I made a post for the channel telling you guys that I was going to play Kazan live on stream starting tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or, you know, technically today. And I've already played through the game once with the dual wield build, and I had a lot of fun. And so I was asking everybody what I should go with for the second playthrough, whether it be the spear or the greatsword. And I put a little bit of a poll on the channel. So it looks like the greatsword just barely edged out the spear. I was really surprised at how close it was. So starting tomorrow, we'll be checking out Kazan, and I will be using the greatsword for the entirety of the playthrough once I get it unlocked, which shouldn't really take me too long because I'm pretty familiar with the intro portion of the game. So, smash that bell? No. So, I guess to whet our palates, I'm gonna go ahead and play the trailer if you guys want to have an inkling of what this game is about if you have not heard of it before. So why are they always like IGN's trailers more than the actual ones? Oh yeah, and they've done like a bunch of dev stuff as well. So do we just have like a normal trailer? No wonder why. Right, I guess I'll just go with the IGN trailer. Oh yeah, and a little bit of context. The first Berserker Kazan is set in the same universe as Dungeon Fighter Online. I don't really know too much about DNF. I played a tiny bit eons ago, and yeah, I really couldn't tell you.
Everything that defined me is gone.
Oh, this has no captions. Okay. Scally's said it uses the characters and setting, but the story is unrelated. Oh yeah, that's true. I forgot to mention that much. So it's like set in the same universe, but it doesn't really have like a super direct connection. I think Kazan is a named character, but you don't really see him or anything like that.
I thought if we defeated him, we could save the world. But I was wrong. We risked everything for them, only to be repaid in blood.
So right now, because it's like more of a cinematic trailer, the camera angle is a little bit different than what you'd get in the game. It's kind of just like a fairly traditional Souls-like in terms of like the moment-to-moment action.
Tell me the truth!
All of this was part of his plan.
Scalpel! No, not you two. Everyone I loved is dead, and my name stained in treason. All because of you. Stop the chaos, mortal.
Ah, damn it, I was muted. Thank you. So, Chadwick was saying it's weird having the high texture stuff next to the cel shaded character models, and I was saying, yeah, I definitely know what you mean about that. I'm not the craziest about the art style. I think it's just kind of good enough to work as a medium for the game, and it's made in Unreal Engine, and it still does have like a lot of the same problems as Unreal Engine games, unfortunately. So, it kind of sucks having not like super high fidelity models have those problems, but it works pretty well for what it is. For a game called The First Berserker, Kazan doesn't really get angry that often. That's kind of one of my complaints about it. True.
If we set this world ablaze with your anger, what would come of it? Stand with me, Kazan.
Born to Rage out now. So yeah, that is the game that I'll begin playing on stream tomorrow. It's actually a surprisingly lengthy game for what it is, so it might take us a decent chunk to get through it. So I'm assuming we'll be done before Night Rain, especially since I've already played the game before and I'm a lot more familiar this time around, although it will be different for me using a completely different weapon as well. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you guys are as well. Methode said he's the first Berserker. We're still working out the process. Fair enough. Fair enough. The other thing that I was going to say about the game is like the story is all right. It's not that great. It's kind of more of an action game through and through. What had happened was Kazan and his friend Ozma defeated the Berserk dragon Hismar that was wreaking havoc on the realm. And the reward for defeating the Berserk dragon was betrayal by the Emperor. And you kind of start off the game being exiled to a distant land with the tendons in your arms being cut. And so through your rage, you kind of have to claw your way back out of your situation and get revenge. So yeah, we'll be checking that one out tomorrow. So with all that being said and done, I think that'll pretty much be it for tonight's stream. So as always, I want to thank you all for joining and participating and lurking. I appreciate that. Hopefully, we'll catch you on the next one at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, until then, take care, stay safe. Last Protagonist out.